There is a city on the banks of a great river, in a time so distant that the river has changed its course since then, and the city has become dust, and the dust has become farmland, and the farmland feeds people who have never heard of any of this. The city was called Savatthi, and it was one of the 6 great cities of ancient India, a place of merchants and monks and river breezes and the smell of jasmine and burning ghee and the noise a city makes when it is fully alive. A morning that looked like every other morning. The same light, the same sounds. A young woman stood inside a house that was not quite hers. She had married into it. That matters. She had come from a poor family, a family so poor that her own relatives had called her by a nickname that wasn't meant kindly. Kisa. The thin one, the slight one, the one without much, none. She had grown up knowing she was considered less than, and she had carried that knowledge the way you carry something heavy you have stopped noticing. In the set of your shoulders, in the way you ask permission before speaking. And she had married, and then, because life is not interested in simple arcs, she had a son. Stay with her, because this is the moment everything else hinges on. Not the moment he died, the moment she had him. None. The moment she looked at this new face and understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she was capable of a love so enormous it had no edges. That she was not, had never been, as small as the name suggested. He was not large, her boy. He was the size all infants are, the size that fits exactly in the crook of one arm, that tucks into the chest as though the chest was shaped specifically to receive him. But the weight he had in her life was total. He was the first thing she had ever had that was entirely undeniably hers. And then one morning he did not wake up. This is not a story about death. This is not a story about Buddhism. This is not a story about the past. This is a story about the thing you carry when you can't put it down. The thing your arms insist on holding long after the holding makes no logical sense because logic has nothing to do with it. Because love has never once asked logic for permission. She held him. He had died in the night or in the early hours, the way infants sometimes do, without warning, without visible cause. That terrible silence that follows a life too brief to have made much sound. And Kisa Gotami, the thin one, the slight one, the woman who had finally found something that made her feel large. She picked him up, and she did not put him down. This is what grief does in its first hours. Not everyone knows this who hasn't lived it. The body refuses, the arms refuse. Some part of the nervous system that is older than language, older than thought, keeps insisting that warmth will return, that the stillness is temporary, that if you just hold on, if you just keep holding on, something will shift. The mind knows, the body does not accept it. So she held him, and she walked. Here's what most people miss about that moment. She wasn't in denial, exactly, she knew. Somewhere underneath the holding, she knew. But knowing and accepting are not the same country. They are not even on the same map. She had moved into a territory for which she had no language, no preparation, no guide, and the only thing her body knew to do was move forward, on. The Pali word for what she was experiencing, the particular texture of it, is dukkha. You may have been told it simply means suffering, and if you spend any time around Buddhist teachings, you will hear it often. That is only the beginning of what it means. Dukkha is the word for that unsatisfactoriness that is woven into conditioned existence, not just the sharp pain of catastrophic loss, but the low-grade ache of everything that cannot stay. The knowledge, mostly unexamined, mostly pushed below the surface, that the things we love are mortal, that the moments we cherish are already ending as we live them. Dukkha is the crack in the bowl that you don't notice until you try to fill it and find it leaking. It is the subtle wrongness that hides inside even our happiest moments, if we are honest enough to feel for it. And Kisa Gotami was feeling it now. Not subtly, she carried her son through the house. She carried him out the door. The morning light was the particular gold of early day in that part of the world. Thick, horizontal, a kind that makes everything look briefly sacred. She didn't notice it. She walked into the street. Pay attention to what she doesn't say. No scream came, no calling out. She was past that. Now she walked. with the purposefulness of someone who has decided, without consciously deciding, that there must be a solution. That if she walks far enough, asks the right person, finds the right door, something can still be fixed. This is not irrational. Or rather, it is irrational in exactly the way grief always is, which means it is entirely human, which means it is entirely understandable, which means you have probably felt some version of this yourself, a conviction that somewhere, somehow, there is a person or a place or a word that can undo the thing that cannot be undone. She went to the neighbors first. The neighbors were the reasonable choice. You go to the people you know. You go to the people who have seen you before, who know your face, who might be moved by the fact of your child's weight in your arms. You go with the thing you cannot accept and you say, in some form or another, help me. They did not help her. Some of them recoiled. Some of them tried to explain gently that there was nothing to be done, that the boy was gone, that she needed to put him down, that she needed to let them prepare the body in the proper way. Some of them, and this is the detail that cuts, laughed. Not from cruelty exactly, though it felt like cruelty. They laughed from discomfort, from the very human response to a sight so raw that the nervous system reaches for anything, even laughter, to get some distance from it. At each door she turned and walked away. She kept walking. Into the next street next. The city going about its mourning around her. The vendors setting up their stalls, the monks on alms rounds with their bowls, the children running, the ox carts slow and grinding on the stone. The ordinary world, completely indifferent, moving at its regular speed. And her, walking in a different kind of time entirely. The time of the unbearable moment, which does not move at all and also lasts forever. Hold that image in your mind. She walked for a long time, long enough for the gold of early morning to become the white heat of midday, long enough for her arms to ache in the physical sense, not just the other sense, long enough for something, some small, still, exhausted part of her to begin to wonder whether this particular road was going to lead anywhere at all. And then someone said, "Go to the Buddha." There is a question the Buddha was never asked directly, and an answer he gave only once, not in words but in a task. We will come back to that answer. Not yet, but we will. She didn't know him. She knew of him, the way people in Savatthi knew of him. He was the wandering teacher, the former prince, the one who sat under the tree, the one whose followers wore saffron and moved through the streets in the early morning with their bowls held just so. She may have seen him at a distance. She may have heard his name on a street corner, the way you hear a name that hasn't yet attached itself to any real meaning in your life. But someone said, "Go to the Buddha," and she went. Now watch what the second mark of existence does to a person in motion. Anicca. This is the Pali word pronounced anicca, and it means impermanence. It is the first of the three marks of existence in the Buddha's teaching, the first thing he points at when he tries to describe the nature of conditioned reality. Everything that arises passes away. Everything that comes together comes apart. Everything that has a beginning will have an end. The flower, the dynasty, the thought, the breath, the self, the child. Kisa Gotami was not thinking about this word. She had never heard it. But she was living inside it, had been living inside it her entire life, as we all are, now without knowing the name of the place we inhabit. Impermanence is not a teaching you receive. It is a fact you are embedded in from the first moment of your existence. A teaching is only the moment someone points at what has always been there and says, "Look." She wasn't ready to look. Not yet. She arrived at Jetavana, the great monastery that the merchant Anathapindika had built just outside the city walls, donated to the Buddha and his community of monks, a garden of shady trees and simple buildings where the Sangha lived and practiced and received visitors. The trees were old enough to provide real shade. The ground was swept. There was a quality of stillness in the air that was different from other places. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of something gathered. She walked through the gate. The monks she encountered first were uncertain what to do with her. Here was a woman, her clothes disordered, Her eyes, the eyes of someone who has been awake for too many hours and has moved through too many stages of feeling to still look like a person operating normally, holding the body of a child, and holding it with the kind of determination that suggested she would not be easily separated from it. They stepped back, they looked at each other, they looked at her, and then Ananda came. Ananda was the Buddha's closest attendant, the one who had been at his side for more years than most monks had been ordained, the one with the extraordinary memory, the one who loved the teacher with an uncomplicated devotion that sometimes got him into trouble and sometimes opened doors that would have remained closed to someone more guarded. He saw her. He didn't flinch. He came toward her. He brought her forward. There's a detail here that's easy to walk past. He didn't ask her to put the child down first. He didn't explain the protocol or the proper way to approach. He simply brought her forward. This woman with her terrible cargo. This woman at the end of something she couldn't name. And he placed her in front of the Buddha. And the Buddha looked at her. This is the moment everything begins. Not the mustard seed, not the task he is about to give her. This moment, before any word is spoken, when a man who had spent decades learning to see clearly looked at a woman who was carrying the full unbearable weight of love and loss, and did not look away. What she felt in that moment, we can only approximate. The texts don't record the inside of her chest, but we can imagine, and we should, because this story is asking us to imagine, is asking us to put ourselves in the place of someone this undone, what it is like to have someone look at you, fully and without flinching, when you are at your most undefended. When you have no more performance left in you, no more composure, no more presentation of the person you usually try to be. When you are only this, a woman with a dead child in her arms, asking for something she has no words for. He looked at her, and then he spoke. Not. That comes in the next part of this story. For now, hold this image. The gate, the garden, the monks who didn't know what to do, the attendant who brought her forward anyway, the teacher who looked, and her the thin one, the slight one, the woman who had finally found something that made her feel large and who had lost it and who was here still holding. You left her at the threshold of Jetavana. She was still holding him, and her arms had not changed their mind about that. Let's step back into that garden with her now. There is a quality of attention in that place, even in the way the monks move through it, and the way their robes catch the light between the trees, the way their sandals make almost no sound on the swept earth. That is different from the city she has just walked through. The city was noise and motion and the indifference of public space. This place is something else, something deliberately slow, something that has been, through years of practice and intention, tuned to a frequency most of the world does not use. Kisa Gotami does not notice any of this. She is past noticing things. She is in that state that extreme grief produces, a narrowing, a tunneling, a reduction of the entire world to the single point of the thing that cannot be fixed. The trees mean nothing. The stillness means nothing. The monks who step back from her with uncertain eyes, they mean very little. She is here because someone told her to come here. She is here because she has run out of other places. She walked through the gate and she stood in the garden with her son in her arms and she waited for something to happen. There's one more thing she carries that the story doesn't name directly. She carries shame. This is easy to miss because the narrative moves quickly to what the Buddha does, and we focus on him. But think about what she has already been through before she arrived here. Think about the neighbors who recoiled, the people who laughed, not from cruelty perhaps, but the effect of laughter when you are already broken is the same whether the laughter means to be cruel or not. She has walked through the streets of Savatthi with a dead child in her arms, and she has been turned away at door after door, and that turning away has accumulated. She is a woman who was already called the thin one, the slight one, the one without much, and she has just been told by every door that closed that what she is carrying is too difficult for the people around her to look at. She is not only grieving, She is grieving while also feeling, somewhere beneath the grief, the old familiar weight of being too much and not enough at the same time. Pay attention to what the monks do. They step back. This is honest. Most of us step back when something is too raw, not too outside the frame of what we have prepared ourselves for. The body moves away before the mind has decided anything. None. The monks of Dhavana were people of practice and study and real discipline, and they still stepped back from the sight of her. This is not a criticism. This is a description of the ordinary human response to the unbearable. Most of us have done it. Most of us have been on the other side of it too, standing with something we couldn't hold alone while the people around us found reasons to be somewhere else. And then Ananda came toward her. Ananda is one of the most interesting figures in the entire Pali canon, and he tends to be somewhat underestimated. And most people remember him as the keeper of memory, the disciple whose extraordinary recall preserved the Buddha's discourses across decades before they were written down. But what the texts reveal, if you read them slowly, is that Ananda was also the one who kept showing up for the people that the formal structure of the Sangha didn't quite know what to do with. He advocated for the ordination of women when others hesitated. He sat with the sick. He walked toward the people walking with too much. He came toward her. He didn't explain anything. He didn't ask her to compose herself, or to put the child down, or to tell him why she was here in terms that would make sense to him. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you have understood, not intellectually, but in your body, in the thing under thought, that they are carrying something real, and he brought her forward. The Pali word that describes the quality of what Ananda was practicing in this moment, what he was actually offering her, will come later in this story, in a different chapter, when we look at what the teaching actually prescribes for the care of those who suffer. But feel the shape of it now, the quality of being moved toward rather than away from, and the quality of not requiring someone to be less broken before you will approach them. He brought her to the Buddha. And now, hold this, because this is the moment that the whole story pivots on, and it is easy to let it pass too quickly. The Buddha was a man who, by this point in his life, had been teaching for decades. He had sat with kings and beggars, with scholars and farmers, with people who came to him from profound philosophy and people who came to him from profound desperation. He had, by any reasonable accounting, seen everything that human suffering produces. He was not easily shocked, and he was not easily moved in the way that destabilizes, that sentimental movement that tips over into helplessness. He had learned not through years of practice and the particular kind of compassion that comes from having genuinely faced one's own interior darkness, how to be with suffering without flinching and without drowning. But here is what the texts record. He looked at her. Not past her, not through her, not at the situation she represented or the teaching opportunity she presented or the crowd that might be gathered watching. He looked at her. At Kisa Gotami, this specific woman, with this specific child, in this specific moment of undoing. Now watch what the Buddha does, because it isn't what you'd expect. He does not explain. He does not begin a discourse. He does not say, impermanence is the nature of all conditioned things, and therefore what you are experiencing is the inevitable consequence of attachment, all of which is true, all of which would have been useless. He asks her a question, not what is it you're carrying, or some version of that. The texts give us the bones of the exchange, not the exact words, but the structure is clear. He asked her to tell him to say it, not because he didn't know. There was nothing visible about the situation that required explanation, but because being asked to name the thing you are carrying is itself a form of being witnessed, and it is the beginning of the transition from the territory where grief has no language to the territory where it begins to become something that can be held in words, and therefore eventually looked at. She told him her son was dead. She told him she needed medicine to bring him back. There's a detail here that's easy to walk past, she said. Medicine. Not miracle, not magic. Medicine. Even in the depth of her grief, even with her arms full of what she could not accept, she was asking in the language of the possible. She was reaching for a category of solution that existed in the world she knew. Healers, remedies, knowledge that certain plants could do certain things. That the right person with the right knowledge could sometimes reverse what seemed irreversible. She was not, in that moment, asking for the impossible. She was asking for something that was just barely outside the reach of what she believed could exist. He listened to all of it. The Pali word for what the Buddha had developed over decades of practice that allowed him to do this, to receive the full weight of another person's suffering without collapsing under it or reflexively trying to make it smaller, is karuna. Ka-aro-o-nya, owned. You will sometimes see this translated simply as compassion, but that translation, while not wrong, is thinner than the word deserves. Karuna is not the soft feeling that arises when you see something sad from a safe distance. It is not the warmth of charitable concern. The Sanskrit root, karu, carries the sense of something that makes a sound, a cry, the sound that suffering makes when it is finally heard. And karuna is the compassion that walks into the burning building. It is the capacity to be genuinely moved by another person's pain, not overwhelmed by it, not destabilized by it, but truly moved, and to let that movement generate action rather than paralysis. It is, in the Buddha's understanding, one of the 4 Brahmaviharas, the 4 divine abidings, the 4 states of mind and heart that represent the highest form of human emotional and spiritual development. And it is what was in the room, what was in the garden, under the trees, with the monk stepping back at a cautious distance. When the Buddha listened to Kisa Gotami tell him what she needed, he let her finish, and then he said, "I can help you. But first, I need you to bring me something." She looked at him, he said, "Bring me a mustard seed." And something must have shifted in her chest, some small, compressed, exhausted thing that had been waiting for exactly this. Someone who said yes instead of no. Someone who said there is a thing to do, a task, a direction. Because grief in its first stages is not only the weight of loss, it is also the weight of helplessness, the unbearable sensation of having nothing to do with the energy that love generates when it has nowhere left to go. She had been walking for hours. She had been moving, and now someone was asking her to move with purpose. Bring me a mustard seed, but not just any mustard seed. The Buddha paused, and then he said, "Bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never known death." She didn't hear the second part the way we hear it. Reading it centuries later with the full weight of what we already know about how the story ends. She heard it the way you hear a condition on a task, when the task itself is the thing you've been desperate for. Quickly, gratefully, storing the condition somewhere to the side of full attention because the task is the important thing. A house that has never known death, fine. She would find one. She would knock on every door in Savatthi if she had to. She would find one. She was certain she would find one. And she set out. But before she goes, before we follow her back, out through the gate and into the streets of the city, notice what just happened in that garden. Notice that the teacher gave her a task instead of a teaching. That he sent her back into the world she had just walked through, but now with a purpose and a direction. Notice that the task appeared to be about finding a seed, but was actually about something else entirely, something she could not have been told directly because it had to be experienced, walked into, discovered through the doing rather than the hearing. Notice that he knew, he must have known, what she would find at every door, and he sent her anyway. The question of why he sent her this way rather than simply explaining it. Why the Buddha of all people, the greatest teacher of his era, chose a task over a sermon is a question we will return to in this story. There is a word for what he was doing, an old word from Sanskrit, and it describes one of the most sophisticated things a teacher can do. We will come back to it. For now, follow her. She walked back out through the gate of Jetavana, still holding her son, her face changed in some small but visible way by the fact of having been looked at and not turned away. Now the city was still doing what cities do in the middle of the day. indifferent, busy, full of its own concerns. She walked to the first house. She knocked. And here, in this moment, at this door, before we hear the answer, is where the teaching actually begins, not in the garden, not in the words the Buddha spoke. Here, at the threshold of the first door, with her knuckles against the wood, and her arms still full of the things she cannot put down, here is where she starts to learn what the seed really is. She knocked on the first door. A woman answered, middle-aged, and with the look of someone who has been managing a household for long enough that managing has become the shape of her face. Competent, watchful, slightly tired in a way that is not complaint but simply fact. And she looked at Kisa Gotami. She looked at what Kisa Gotami was carrying. Something moved through her expression, the beginning of a flinch, quickly controlled, and then she waited. Kisa Gotami asked for a mustard seed, from a house that had never known death. The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We cannot help you with that condition. My mother-in-law died in this house 3 years ago. My husband's brother the year before that. There are dead in every room of this house if you count back far enough." She said it without particular grief, and it was simply the inventory of a life, the accumulated departures that any household collects over time, the way it collects furniture and debt, and the particular smell of the people who have slept and cooked and argued within its walls. She wasn't refusing Kisa Gotami from hardness. She was stating a fact. Kisa Gotami thanked her and moved to the next door. Stay with her as she walks that short distance between one threshold and the next. It is a distance of perhaps 20 steps. In those 20 steps, she is still certain. The first house was simply the wrong house. There will be other houses. Savatthi is a large city. The Buddha told her to find a seed, and she will find one. And then she will go back to him, and he will give her the medicine, and her son will open his eyes. She is still in the version of the story where this is possible. Knocked on the second door. An old man answered. He leaned on the door frame the way people lean when standing upright has become an act of negotiation rather than a reflex. He listened to her request. He shook his head slowly. His wife had died in this house, he said. His eldest son. A grandchild who had not lived past her second year. He gestured vaguely at the interior of the house behind him, as though the deaths were still there, visible to him in specific corners, specific chairs. He looked at the child in her arms. He did not say anything about that, but the look said something. The look said, "I know what you are carrying." And the knowing was not comfort, exactly. It was something else. A kind of terrible kinship, the recognition between two people who are standing on the same ground, even though one of them has had longer to learn the name of the territory. She thanked him and moved on. The third house, the fourth. By the fifth, something has begun to shift in her. Not a letting go, not an understanding, not anything as named and resolved as that. Something more like a weather change. The certainty of the first door has not disappeared, but it has become less solid. There is a hairline crack in it now, so small she could still pretend not to see it. At the sixth door, a young woman answered who could not have been much older than Kisa Gotami herself. She had a child on her hip, living loud, tugging at her clothing with the cheerful insistence of a toddler who has not yet learned that adults are sometimes in the middle of something. The young woman looked at Kisa Gotami's son. She looked at Kisa Gotami's face, and she said, quietly, that her own father had died in this house last year, that her first child had not survived his first month. She said, "I am sorry." And she meant it. Not as a formality, as a genuine thing, moving from her chest across the threshold into the space between them. This is where it turns, not the mustard seed, not the graveyard. This moment, the sixth door, the young mother with the living child on her hip, the words "I am sorry" said by someone who has her own inventory of loss and who offers the fact of that inventory not as a barrier but as a bridge. Kisa Gotami stood at that threshold for a long moment. Then she moved on. And here's the part nobody tells you about grief. It doesn't end in a single revelation. It doesn't crack open all at once, like something dropped on stone. It opens slowly, door by door, threshold by threshold, one small admission at a time. The mind that has sealed itself against an unbearable truth does not break. It softens. It finds gradually that the thing it has been refusing to feel has been there all along, not outside the seal, pressing in, but already inside, already waiting. Patient in the way that only true things can afford to be patient. She kept walking, she kept knocking, she kept asking. Now consider what she is doing from the outside, from the perspective of the people answering the doors. Here is a woman clearly unwell in the specific way that extreme grief produces, carrying the body of a small child, not asking whether death has ever visited your house. This is not a normal request. This is not a comfortable thing to be asked by a stranger on an ordinary afternoon. And yet, door after door, the people of Savatthi answered her. They told her things. They named their dead. They opened their inventories and laid them out, not because she asked for their grief, but because she asked a question that made their grief suddenly relevant, suddenly worth speaking. What she was collecting at every door was not a mustard seed. She was collecting stories. Here's what most people miss about that. The Buddha knew this would happen. He knew. He must have known. With the knowledge of someone who has spent decades studying the nature of human suffering, that there is no house without its dead. That the condition he attached to the seed was not a filter designed to find the rare household that had somehow escaped death, but a key designed to open every household she approached, not to the seed, but to the story, the inventory, to the naming of the names. He gave her a task that required her to go to every door in the city and ask people to tell her about their dead. And in the asking, and in the telling, and in the space that opened between one bereaved person and another, something was already beginning to shift. Not because anyone explained it to her, because she was living it. The Pali word for what she was accumulating, not consciously, not philosophically, but in her body, and the change that was slowly working its way through her chest with each door and each refusal and each quiet recitation of names is upadana, upapadana, usually translated as clinging or attachment. But the word carries more texture than that. Upadana is the act of taking up, of grasping, the way the mind wraps itself around something and makes it the foundation of its sense of reality. She had taken up her son, made him, in the deepest possible way, the ground she stood on, and what each door was doing, each gentle no, each inventory of other people's losses, was showing her, not telling her, what that ground actually is, and what everything we build our weight on actually is. She did not have this word yet, but the thing it describes was moving through her. Now here is a detail that most retellings skip entirely. Ashvaghosha, a great Sanskrit poet of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, wrote a life of the Buddha called the Buddha Charita, and in it he gives extraordinary attention to the moment that Siddhartha Gautama, still a prince, hence, still living inside the walls of his father's palace, first encountered death. His father had tried to shield him from it. Whole architecture of the young prince's life had been built as a kind of fortress against the 4 sights: aging, sickness, death, and the renunciant. But the fortress didn't hold. It never does. When Siddhartha saw the corpse, for the first time in his sheltered life, the body of a person who had been alive and was now not, Ashvaghosha writes that he could not look away, that he sat with it. The charioteer Channa tried to move him along, tried to explain that this was simply how things were, simply the nature of conditioned existence. And the young prince said, "Then I cannot continue as though I have not seen it." He was not running from the sight of death. He was running toward whatever could honestly account for it. Kisa Gotami was doing the same thing. Not philosophically, not with the clarity of a prince who has the luxury of philosophical crisis. She was doing it with the specific, desperate, forward motion of a woman who has been to 50 doors in one afternoon and is beginning to understand something she is not yet ready to say out loud. The sun was lower now, the shadows of the buildings were longer, and the city had moved through the middle of the day and into the early evening, and she had been walking for hours, and her arms, the physical arms, the muscles and tendons that had been holding this weight since morning, were burning in the simple mechanical sense. She sat down, not because she decided to, because her legs made the decision for her, the way the body sometimes overrules the mind when the mind has stopped being available for rational consultation. She sat down on the ground at the edge of a street in the long shadow of a wall with her son still in her arms, and she sat there for a long time, and something came apart, not loudly, not dramatically. Something in her chest, some last resistance, some final insistence that this was fixable, that there was still a house she hadn't tried, a door that would open onto the answer she had been looking for. That thing released. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. And in that release was the beginning of grief. True grief, not the grief of refusal, the grief that keeps moving, keeps knocking, keeps insisting that the thing is reversible, but the grief that finally agrees to feel what has actually happened, the grief that sits down and stops running, the grief that opens its mouth and breathes. She understood something in that moment that she could not yet put into words. Something about every door she had knocked on. Something about the woman with the child on her hip who had said, "I am sorry." Something about the old man with the dead in his corners. And something about the fact that she had walked through the entire city and found not a single house without its dead. And that this was not a failure of her search, but the answer to it. Here's the part that lands differently at 3 in the morning. She came looking for a house that had never known death, and what she found was that there is no such house. At every threshold in the city, in the world, is a threshold where someone has stood with exactly what she is carrying. That the weight in her arms is not unique to her. That loss is not the exception to human experience. And it is woven into the fabric of it, threaded through every household, every family, every life that has ever been lived all the way to its end. This is not comfort, exactly. Not in the way comfort usually presents itself. Soft, not consoling, promising that the pain will pass. It is something harder and stranger and more real than that. It is the knowledge that you are not alone in the most specific possible sense. Not alone as a metaphor. Not alone as a feeling. Not alone because another person is present. Alone in the literal sense that the particular ground you thought you were standing on uniquely, that particular territory of loss you thought was yours to suffer in solitude, it is inhabited. It has always been inhabited. You are standing in a country with a very large population, and every single one of them has lost someone they could not let go of. There is a word in the Pali for this kind of knowing, not the intellectual knowing, but the knowing that settles in the body, that changes the quality of the breath. We will come to it in time. For now, sit with her. She sat in the long shadow of the wall. She looked at her son. She saw him perhaps for the first time since he stopped breathing. Saw him, actually, rather than through the gauze of what she needed him to be. He was small. He was still. He was, in the specific and irreversible sense that she had been refusing all day, gone. She stayed with that for a long time. Then, when she was ready, when something in her had moved through enough of the first layer of what needed to be moved through, she got up. She did not go back to a door. She did not look for a seat. She went to where the dead of Savathi were taken, and she laid her son down in the proper way, and she said whatever words a mother says in that moment, and she let the people who were there help her with the rest, and she went back to the Buddha, not to ask for medicine, not to demand an explanation. She went back to the Buddha the way you go back to the person who gave you a task that turned out to be entirely different from the task you thought you were being given. She went back with empty hands. If this story is landing for you tonight, if something in these doors and these names and this woman sitting down in the dust is finding a place in you it recognizes, the subscribe button on this channel costs you nothing and helps more of these stories reach the people who need them. You can also tap the notification bell so the next one finds you. Now, back to her. She's walking through the gate of Jetavana again, and this time her arms are empty and she is ready to hear what the teacher actually has to say. She walked through the gate of Jetavana for the second time that day with nothing in her hands. This is worth pausing on, because the first time she walked through that gate, she had everything. Or rather, she had the one thing that had made everything else feel like enough. She had the weight, she had the holding, she had the fierce, exhausted, irrational insistence of her arms, and now her arms were at her sides. And the garden looked the same as it had hours ago. The same trees, the same swept earth, the same quality of deliberate stillness. But she was not the same person who had walked out of it. She was not better. Let's be clear about that. She was not healed. She was not at peace. She was not the woman who would eventually become one of the great teachers of her era, the woman whose own verses would be preserved in the Therigatha for 2,500 years. She was simply, and this is not a small thing, even if it sounds small, no longer running. She walked toward the Buddha, and she stood in front of him with empty hands. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time, without flinching, without the particular kind of relief that would have been insulting, the relief of someone who had been worried she wouldn't come back, who needed her to be better for their own sake. He simply looked at her and waited. She said, "I could not find the seed. I went to every house," she said. "I asked at every door, and there is no house in this city that has not known death." Then she said something, or the silence that followed said it for her, that was different from anything she had said or not said that morning. She was not asking for medicine anymore. She was not asking him to fix the thing that could not be fixed. She was standing in front of him with the knowledge she had gathered at 50 doors or 100, and she was letting that knowledge be what it was, not trying to turn it into something else. He nodded. "That's all." He nodded, and then he spoke. Not a long discourse, not a formal teaching with its numbered components and its structured progression from premise to conclusion. He said, "In the way you say something to someone who has just learned a difficult thing and learned it in their body rather than their head, you looked for the seed among the living, but death visits every house. This is not your burden alone. This has always been the nature of things." There is a word in Sanskrit for what he had just done by sending her out with that impossible condition. The word is upaya. Skillful means, and it describes the capacity, the art really, of meeting someone exactly where they are and giving them not the truth as an abstraction, but the truth as an experience they can actually enter. The Buddha was, among many things, a master of upaya. He understood that a teaching heard is not the same as a teaching lived, and that Kisa Gotami could have sat in that garden all afternoon and listened to him explain the universality of death and impermanence. He could have been eloquent, precise, not philosophically airtight, and she would have heard it the way we hear things we are not yet ready to receive. Through glass, at a distance, with the part of the mind that processes information while the part of the mind that actually governs our lives continues doing exactly what it was doing before. So he gave her a task instead, and the task was the teaching. And he didn't tell her that no house is without its dead. He sent her to find out. There's a difference between those two things that is almost everything. And here is the part that still moves scholars who have studied this story for decades. The detail that Sariputta, who was present that day in the garden, is said to have reflected on for years afterward. Sariputta was the chief disciple in wisdom. He was, by the accounts of the canon, the most intellectually formidable person in the Sangha, the one who could out-argue anyone, who had arrived at deep understanding through the rigorous application of a magnificent mind. He understood everything the Buddha had taught. He could explain it in 17 different ways. He could anticipate the objections and dismantle them with the precision of a physician making a diagnosis, and he said, years later, that watching the Buddha with Kisa Gotami taught him something that all his years of doctrinal study had not. The teacher did not give her the Dhamma, and he gave her the Dhamma's shape, the outline of the teaching pressed into the texture of an afternoon's walking, and then he let her fill it in from the inside. Sariputta had spent years learning the map. That afternoon, watching her, he understood something the map had never shown him. the difference between a map and the territory, a Pali word for the kind of attention that Kisa Gotami was beginning to develop, the quality of presence that makes it possible to see what is actually here rather than what we need to be here, is sati, mindfulness, most translations. But the word carries more than the contemporary usage of mindfulness tends to convey. Sati is not relaxation. It is not the pleasant diffusion of attention that the word has come to suggest in the modern world, a soft focus awareness of breath and body that you practice for 10 minutes in the morning with an app. Sati is clear seeing. It is the capacity to look at what is actually present in the body, in the moment and nature of the experience you are having, without the habitual overlays of what you want to be present, what you fear is present, what you are convinced should be present. Kisa Gotami had been living inside a story all day. The story was, "My son is ill and I am looking for medicine." It was not a delusional story. It was the story her grief needed in order to keep moving, to keep her upright and walking rather than collapsed in the street. The story was, in its way, kind to her. It gave her forward motion when forward motion was the only thing keeping her functional. But it was not the truth of what was happening. And sati, the capacity to see clearly, is what begins to develop when the story finally softens enough for the truth to come into focus. She was beginning to see, not everything, not all at once. This is not how it works. And the story does not pretend that it is. She was beginning to see the first layer of what was actually true, that her son was gone, that she was not the only person who had ever stood where she was standing. That the city she had walked through all day was a city full of people carrying exactly the kind of weight she had thought was hers alone. That is not a small thing to begin to see. It is, in fact, the beginning of the whole path. And here is something you might recognize. You have sat in a waiting room, a hospital waiting room, or something functionally equivalent, some room where you were waiting for news about someone you loved. And the news might go either way. You know this room, the particular quality of time in that room. The magazines no one reads. The fluorescent light that is designed, apparently, to be as neutral as possible and achieves instead a kind of aggressive colorlessness. The other people in the chairs, each of them inside their own version of the same suspended moment. And at some point, maybe after an hour, maybe after 3, something shifted in you, a slow recognition. That the person across from you, the one with the paper coffee cup and the eyes that weren't quite focused on anything, they were waiting too. And that the woman by the window who had been on her phone for an hour, her voice very low and very controlled, she was managing something. That everyone in this room was inside a version of exactly what you were inside. That knowledge, that specific particular knowledge that your fear and your love and your helplessness were not yours alone, did something, didn't fix anything, didn't change the news, whatever the news would be, but did something. That is what the doors were doing for Kisa Gotami. This is not Buddhist doctrine, exactly. Or rather, it is Buddhist doctrine, but it is also something older than any doctrine, and something that precedes all formal teaching. It is the thing that happens when human beings stop pretending to each other that they are not afraid. When the armor comes off, even briefly, even between strangers at a doorway, and what is revealed is not weakness but the simple, enormous fact of shared vulnerability. The fact that we are all, every one of us, carrying things we didn't ask to carry through a world that did not promise us it would be fair. This is the thing that changes when you know it not as information but as experience. This is the thing that the 50 doors taught Kisa Gotami that the Buddha's words could not have taught her. Not that afternoon, not in the state she was in when she arrived. This is not about acceptance in the passive sense. The defeated shrug, the resignation that calls itself peace. And This is not about telling yourself that everyone suffers so your suffering doesn't matter. This is not about diminishing the irreplaceable, enormous weight of the particular person you have lost by pointing out that other people have lost people too. Your loss is real. Your loss is specific. Your son, your mother, your friend, yourself as you were before the thing happened. That specific loss belongs to you in a way that no general truth about the universality of suffering can touch or replace. What changes is not the weight of the loss. What changes is the territory you are standing in while you carry it. She stood in front of the Buddha with empty hands, and he looked at her, and something had already begun that would take years to complete. She was at the very beginning of a road she didn't yet know the name of. She had, without knowing the word for it, and taken the first step onto a path that the tradition would eventually call the path of liberation. Not because liberation was available to her that afternoon, not because the grief was done or the wound was healed, but because she had, for the first time, stopped running from the thing that was true and turned to face it. That is the beginning in every life, always. Now, hold the image of Sariputta, standing at the edge of what happened that day, watching. He is the most learned man in the Sangha. He has studied for years. He knows the Dhamma in the way that scholars know things, comprehensively, precisely, with the satisfaction of a mind that has done its work well. And he is watching a woman with empty hands teach him something about what teaching actually is. The teacher did not give her the Dhamma. He gave her the Dhamma's shape. There is a reason this story has been told at every door in the Ganges plain for 2,500 years. Not because it explains impermanence. There are discourses that do that with far more philosophical precision. But because it does not explain it. Because it hands you a task and sends you door to door, and somewhere between the first threshold and the 50th, in the accumulation of other people's names for their dead, something happens that explanation cannot produce. You find out for yourself, and finding out for yourself, not being told, not being convinced, not arriving at intellectual agreement, but finding out in your body at the level of direct experience, is the only kind of knowing that actually changes anything. She stood in front of him with empty hands. He nodded, and the next part of her life began. There is a monk, a Chinese monk, traveling on foot through the Ganges plain in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, 1,000 years after Kisa Gotami walked her road, who recorded something in his journals that stops you if you read it slowly enough. His name was Faxian. He had left China on pilgrimage to find the original Buddhist scriptures, crossing deserts and mountain passes, and the long, flat river valleys of northern India on foot and by boat, taking notes with the particular attention of someone who knows that what he is seeing may not survive the century. He was a careful observer. He wrote about the monasteries he visited, the relics he encountered, the condition of the roads, the quality of the rice. He was not, primarily, a storyteller. He was a documentarian, and in his account of traveling through the villages along the Ganges, he wrote this: every village he passed through, in every town, at every way stop and river crossing, people still told the story of the woman who went looking for a mustard seed, not as history, not as scripture, and as a story that was still alive, still being passed mouth to mouth, grandmother to grandchild, teacher to student, because it was still true, and because every generation produced new people standing at new doors with the same impossible question in their arms. 1,000 years later, still true, hold that. She had laid her son down. She had gone back to the Buddha with empty hands. She had heard him say, in the quiet way he said things when there was nothing to soften and no reason to try. This is the nature of things, and something in her had opened, not healed, not resolved, not arrived anywhere, but opened, a specific way that things open when they have been held shut for too long, and the holding finally becomes more exhausting than the opening. But now what? This is the question the story doesn't answer quickly, and it's worth sitting with the not quick answer, because this is where most of us actually live. Not in the moment of revelation, not in the dramatic opening at the 51st door or the return to the teacher with empty hands, none, but in the long, ordinary, unglamorous afterward, the morning after the thing cracked open, the morning when you wake up and the grief is still there, not as acute, maybe, but not gone, not transformed into wisdom overnight, not yet anything but what it is. A weight that has become slightly more familiar, which is not the same as a weight that has been lifted. She had nowhere to go except forward. She had, in the course of one afternoon, lost the last version of herself that she had been operating from, the version that had a son, the version that had something in her arms. And she had not yet become the next version, the one who would ordain, who would practice, who would eventually sit under a tree of her own and teach other women what she had learned. That version was still years away. What she was right now was someone who had just had the floor removed and had not yet found out what was underneath it. Something very old is happening here, and the thing that is old is this. Kisa Gotami is not a special case. She is not a character in a religious story who is granted special access to a special teacher and thereby spared the ordinary difficulty of actually being a human being. None. She is a woman who lost her child and went to the only person anyone could suggest and received not rescue but direction. And the direction led her into the full experience of what she was trying to escape, and she experienced it, and she came back, and now she has to continue living. This is the story of every person who has ever tried to use spiritual practice as a shortcut past grief rather than a companion through it. And every person who has sat down to meditate in the hope that the sitting would make the thing stop hurting, and found that the sitting made the thing more present, not less, and then had to decide what to do with that. The teaching is not a shortcut. It never was. Now, before we follow Kisa Gotami further into what her life becomes after the mustard seed, there is another woman in this story who needs to be introduced. A woman whose grief was so total, so complete, so utterly demolishing that even the people who knew Kisa Gotami's story considered this woman's story the harder one. Her name was Patacara, a Pali word for the kind of love that generates the particular grief that Patacara carried is Metta, loving kindness in most translations. But Metta is not softness. It is not the mild warmth of general goodwill. None. In its full form, in the form described in the Metta Sutta, the discourse that the tradition considers the definitive teaching on the subject, Metta is described as the love a mother has for her only child, a love that has no reservation in it, the love that would place itself between the child and anything that threatened the child, without calculation, without hesitation, without asking what the cost is first. None. Patacara had this love. She had it for her husband, who was not a match her family approved of. She had run away to marry him, which tells you something about the quality of her wanting. She had it for her two small children, who were the particular age where children are still mostly body, all sensation and motion and trust, not yet complicated by the self-awareness that makes people harder to love simply. She had it for the life she had built with this man in the village they had chosen together, away from her family, on terms that were theirs, and then in the space of a single day she lost all of it. Now here's the part nobody tells you about the worst grief. It doesn't come announced, it doesn't build to a climax and then resolve. Sometimes it arrives all at once, stacked one unbearable thing on top of another before you have had even a moment to absorb the first, until the accumulation is so total that the mind simply stops, cannot process, cannot continue operating in the normal way because the normal way requires a floor and the floor is gone. Her husband died first, snake bite, crossing a flooded river as they tried to travel to her parents' village for the birth of their second child. He was there, and then he was not. That fast, that complete, without preparation or farewell. She crossed the river alone, gave birth on the riverbank in the rain, and in the morning found that her older child, who had been left briefly unattended on the bank, had been taken in the night by a bird of prey. Two gone, before morning dawned. She continued walking toward her parents' village, because there was nowhere else to go. because forward was the only direction that still existed. And then a neighbor met her on the road and told her her father's house collapsed in the storm last night. Both your parents died, your brother too. She stopped in the middle of the road, and then something happened that the texts describe with a kind of careful, not precise restraint. She lost her mind, not metaphorically. She lost the functional operation of the mind that allows a person to navigate the ordinary world. She tore off her clothes. She moved without direction. She made sounds that were not words. She was, in the clinical sense, in acute psychiatric crisis. She was also, in the human sense, doing the only thing available to her, responding honestly to a situation that no sane response could reach. She wandered like this until she reached Jetavana. The monks there did not know what to do with her. They stepped back, as they had stepped back from Kisa Gotami, as most of us step back from the sight of someone this undone. And the Buddha, as he had with Kisa Gotami, came forward. He did not tell her to cover herself, and he did not tell her to calm down. He looked at her the way he had looked at Kisa Gotami, directly without flinching, with that quality of attention that says, I see what is actually here, and I am not going anywhere. And he said, very quietly, Sister, come back to yourself. Not, compose yourself. Not, stop this. Come back to yourself. As though the self was still there, intact, temporarily separated from her by the magnitude of what she was carrying. As though the woman who had run away to marry the man she chose, who had crossed the flooded river, who had kept walking even after the river, as though that woman was still present, still available, just currently unreachable. She heard him. And this is the loop I want to plant with you now, because the story of what happens to Patacara after that moment is one of the most extraordinary things in the Therigatha, a collection of poems left by the enlightened women of the early Sangha. What Patacara became after she lost everything, what she built from the rubble of that afternoon, we will return to. That story is not finished. I haven't forgotten her. But hold her here, at the moment of being called back to herself, because this moment is why her story belongs beside Kisa Gotami's in this telling. Two women, two different textures of total loss, and the same teacher doing the same impossible thing, not fixing the unfixable, not explaining the inexplicable, but simply being present with a quality of attention so complete that it functioned, somehow, as ground. No, when all the other ground was gone. Now here is the thing that Faxian's record tells us. The thing that a Chinese monk walking through the Ganges plain 1,000 years later noticed and wrote down. And the story of the mustard seed was not being told in the monasteries. It was not being preserved in the libraries where the scholars kept the palm leaf manuscripts. It was being told in the villages, by ordinary people, by grandmothers and farmers and fishermen, people who had never studied the Dhamma in any formal sense, who did not know the Pali word for impermanence or the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, but who knew this story, who had learned it from someone who had learned it from someone, in an unbroken chain of telling that stretched back across 1,000 years, because it was useful, and because it was the kind of story that does something when you hear it. Not the kind of story that explains a concept. The kind of story that finds the specific place where you are carrying the thing you cannot put down and sits with you there. This is what the teaching was at its root before it became doctrine, before it became institution, known. Before it became the elaborate architecture of commentaries and sub-commentaries and philosophical schools that it would eventually grow into. It was a set of stories that were useful, that did something in the body of the person who heard them, that could be passed mouth to mouth in a village on the Ganges plain and still be true 1,000 years later because the thing they addressed, the irreducible and ordinary human experience of loss, had not changed. You and I are having this conversation at an enormous distance of time and geography from Savatthi, and this story is still doing what it did when Faxian walked through those villages. Not because the Buddha was magical, not because the Dhamma is the exclusive property of any tradition or culture, but because the thing it addresses has not gone anywhere. because there is still no house without its dead. Because you are still listening to this, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying tonight, and something in the shape of it is reaching the place where the weight is. The Pali word for the loving kindness that Patacara had for her family, the love so total it generated grief so total, is Metta. And the practice of Metta in the tradition is not just a pleasant meditation. It is a direct response to loss. The Metta Sutta, the discourse on loving kindness, was taught, according to tradition, monks who were being disturbed by spirits in a forest. The practical problem was fear, and the solution the Buddha offered was not armor or argument or a change of location. It was the deliberate cultivation of goodwill so expansive that it left no room for the contracted, defended state that fear requires. May all beings be happy. May all beings be safe. May all beings be healthy. May all beings live with ease. When you have lost someone, when the specific face, the specific voice, the specific weight of the person is gone, the practice of metta offers something unexpected. It offers you the ability to continue loving them, not in the sense of pretending they are still present, not in the sense of denial or refusal, but in the sense of extending the love that they generated in you outward, past the boundary of the specific relationship, into the larger space where love has no object and therefore cannot be taken away. The love that was for them becomes love that is. That distinction is subtle and enormous. Patacara would come to understand this. Kisa Gotami would come to understand this. But not yet, not this chapter. We are still in the early hours of their understanding. Still in the place where the grief is what it is, raw, total. Without the mercy of time or the softening of practice, they are beginning. And beginning, the texts are very clear about this, is enough. Beginning is everything. You do not have to see the whole road. You do not have to know the name of where you are going. You have to take the next step, and the one after that, and the road reveals itself, one step at a time, in exactly the amount you need to see it. This is not optimism. And the tradition is not optimistic in the contemporary sense, the sense that suggests things will work out if you think positively about them. The tradition is something more demanding and more honest than optimism. It is the position that reality seen clearly is workable, that the truth about impermanence, looked at directly rather than flinched away from, is not the end of everything but the beginning of something. That Kisa Gotami, standing in Jetavana with empty hands, is not at the end of her story. She is, in fact, just past the beginning. And if Patacara's story is landing somewhere, if the image of her walking forward after the river has found a place in you, the bell icon helps the next story reach you when it comes. Now, back to the road. And the 3rd century before the Common Era, a king stood on a battlefield and looked at what he had done. His name was Ashoka. He was the 3rd emperor of the Maurya dynasty, the man who, at the height of his reign, controlled more of the Indian subcontinent than any ruler before or after him for nearly 2,000 years. He was not a gentle man. He had consolidated his empire through violence and through the ruthlessness that empires require in their making, through the understanding that power at that scale is purchased with blood and maintained with the credible threat of more blood. He knew this and he accepted it, a way men who build empires accept the arithmetic of it, without looking too closely at the individual numbers. And then he looked at Kalinga. Kalinga was a kingdom on the eastern coast, independent, prosperous, resistant. He had wanted it. He had taken it the way he took things, which was completely. The rock edict he had carved afterward, the 13th of the great inscriptions he ordered cut into stone faces across his empire, records that 100,000 people were killed in the Kalinga War. 150,000 were deported. Many times that number died in the aftermath, famine, displacement, a long, slow dying that follows when the structures of ordinary life are destroyed. He stood on that battlefield and he looked at what 100,000 100,000 deaths looks like when it is in front of you rather than in an accounting of strategic objectives. He looked at the irreducible physical fact of that many human beings whose lives had ended because he wanted a coastline, and something broke open in him. Not all at once, not dramatically, away. Stories sometimes compress transformation into a single moment of blinding clarity, but irreversibly. The way a bone breaks, there is a before and an after. No amount of healing quite returns it to the form it had before the break. And the healed bone is in some ways stronger, but it is never again the bone that had not been broken. He had encountered the Dhamma before Kalinga, had met Buddhist monks, had found something in the teaching that interested him. But it had been until that battlefield, an intellectual encounter, the kind of engagement a powerful man has with ideas that he finds congenial and does not expect to cost him anything. After Kalinga, it cost him everything. Or rather, it cost him the version of himself that could stand on a battlefield and feel only the satisfaction of an objective achieved. He never fought another war. The 13th Rock Edict, the one in which he records Kalinga, and his response to it, is one of the most remarkable political documents in human history. It is a king publicly accounting for his own violence, not justifying it, not contextualizing it into strategic necessity, not performing the ritual gestures of regret while continuing as before. He is genuinely accounting for it. He names the 100,000 dead. He names the families of the dead. The parents, the children, the people who were not soldiers but who were killed or displaced or simply unmade by the machinery of his conquest. He says, "This causes me profound sorrow and regret." And this is where the edict becomes something else, something beyond political document into something closer to vow. He says, "True conquest is conquest by the Dhamma. Not the conquest of territory, the conquest of hearts, and the conquest that happens when people choose to live by the teaching because they have found it to be true, not because they have been coerced." He built hospitals, not just for people, for animals too, and he planted shade trees along the major roads of his empire so that travelers could rest. He dug wells. He established rest houses. He sent emissaries not with armies, but with the teaching, to the Hellenistic kingdoms to the west, not a Sri Lanka to the south, to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. He funded the Third Buddhist Council, where the canon was formalized and emissaries were sent in 8 directions to carry the teaching outward. The first welfare state in human history was built from grief. Now here is the thing I want you to hold alongside the story of Kisa Gotami and Patacara. Ashoka's grief was not the grief of a mother for her child. It was the grief of a man who had been the instrument of 100,000 deaths and could no longer pretend that the arithmetic was abstract. It was the grief of someone who had finally allowed himself to see the faces behind the numbers, to experience, in some belated and insufficient but real way, the weight of what he had done. His grief was moral. It was the grief of someone confronting their own capacity for harm, and what he did with it, what the teaching gave him as a container for it, was action, not self-punishment, not retreat, not the spiritual bypassing that uses practice to avoid accountability. Just action, specific, sustained, structural action in the direction of reducing suffering. Upaya again, skillful means. Kisa Gotami was sent door to door, and Ashoka was not sent anywhere. He had a battlefield to stand on, and a teaching that had been waiting for him to be ready to really receive it, and a grief so large that it finally broke through the armor of imperial certainty. The task was different, the shape of the teaching was different, but the mechanism was the same. The truth about suffering, experienced directly and fully rather than at a distance, as the opening into something else, as the door. And there's a question that lives underneath this, and I want to name it directly because you may be carrying a version of it. The question is, if grief is a door, does that mean the grief is good? Does that mean the loss was necessary? Does that mean the 100,000 people who died at Kalinga died so that Ashoka could become a better man? Does that mean Kisa Gotami's son died so that she could become an enlightened teacher? No. The teaching does not say that suffering is good. It does not say that loss is secretly a gift. It does not say that the people who died at Kalinga were necessary instruments in the moral education of an emperor, or that Kisa Gotami's son was a teaching device sent by the universe to accelerate her spiritual development. That is not what the Dhamma says, and that version of the teaching is a corruption of it, the version that gets used to avoid actually feeling the weight of what has happened, impose a narrative of meaning on a loss that did not require your meaning in order to occur. The teaching says suffering exists, loss exists, death exists. These are not mistakes in the design. They are features of conditioned existence, of the kind of reality that arises when causes and conditions come together in the specific way that produces this world, this life, this body, this heart. The suffering is real. The loss is real. The 100,000 dead really dead. And the teaching says, and not but, within that reality there is a path. Not a path that removes the suffering retroactively. Not a path that explains the suffering into something acceptable. A path that moves through the suffering, that uses the energy of the grief as fuel for the journey, rather than a weight that stops all motion. A path that arrives, eventually, not at a place where nothing can hurt you, but at a place where you are large enough to hold the hurt without being defined by it. That is a different thing from saying the grief was good. It is, in fact, a much harder thing, because it asks you to hold both at once, the full weight of the loss and the possibility of the path, without using one to diminish the other, without saying the loss was worth it, because it wasn't, and because that framing makes the loss a transaction and the dead into currency, and without saying there is no path, because there is, because Kisa Gotami walked it, because Ashoka built shade trees. Both things are true at the same time. The grief is real. The path is real. Now let's bring in a man who understood this in his body before he had words for it. His name was Anathapindika. You have heard it before in this story. He was the wealthy merchant who built Jetavana, who purchased the park from Prince Jeta at enormous expense and donated to the Sangha as a place for the teaching to take root. And he was perhaps the most significant lay supporter the Buddha ever had. His generosity was not performative but structural, the kind of giving that creates conditions rather than just expressing sentiment. He was not a man without grief. He had built his wealth the way wealth was built in that era, through trade, through the accumulation of commercial relationships that required constant tending, not through the particular anxiety that comes with having a great deal and therefore a great deal to lose. He had a family, he had people he loved, he had, as all wealthy people discover eventually, the specific realization that wealth is very good at protecting you from certain kinds of suffering and completely useless against others. He came to the Buddha near the end of his life when he was ill, genuinely ill, a way that the body announces it is beginning the final negotiation, and he was afraid. He had supported the Dhamma for decades. He had heard the teaching hundreds of times. In the garden he himself had funded. He knew the words, and he was afraid. Sariputta came to him. Here is what Sariputta said, and notice that it is the same structure as what the Buddha gave Kisa Gotami. Not a doctrine, not an explanation, a direction of attention. He said, do not cling to the eye, to the ear, to the nose, to the tongue, to the body, to the mind. Do not cling to forms, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, objects of mind. Do not cling to consciousness. Do not cling to contact. Not cling to feeling. Do not cling to perception. Do not cling to intention. Do not cling to craving. Anathapindika wept, not from sorrow, he said. In all my years of sitting in this garden listening to the teaching, no one has ever taught me like this. And Sariputta said, this teaching is given to the monastics. It is not usually given to lay people. And Anathapindika said, there are lay people who have only a little dust in their eyes. Not teach them like this. And Sariputta agreed that he was right. The Pali word for what Sariputta was guiding Anathapindika to release in that final illness is anatta. Non-self, the third and perhaps most radical of the three marks of existence. The teaching that what we call the self The solid, continuous, independently existing entity that we believe ourselves to be is not a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb, not a fixed point but a flowing. A river that has the appearance of continuity because it is always water in the same banks, but is never, in any two consecutive moments, the same water. This is the teaching that most people find hardest. Not dukkha. Most people, if they are honest, already suspect that suffering is woven into things. Not anicca. Most people, if pressed, will acknowledge that nothing lasts. Not anatta. The suggestion that the one who suffers, the one who loses, the one who does the acknowledging, that one is also not the fixed thing it believes itself to be. The self that Kisa Gotami was clinging to, the self that was the mother of this specific child, the self whose entire meaning had been organized around that relationship, was not a permanent possession but a temporary configuration. Accurate as far as it went, real in every practical sense, but not ultimately solid, not ultimately stable. Not ultimately the ground she had been building on. This is not cold. In the wrong hands, badly taught, this teaching can sound cold, can sound like the system is telling you that your love was an illusion, your loss is not real, your grief is a misunderstanding of the nature of things. That is the wrong teaching. That is the teaching as anesthesia rather than medicine. The right teaching, the teaching that Sariputta gave to a dying man in a garden, the teaching that Anathapindika received through tears, is something else. It is the recognition that the self you have been so carefully protecting, the self whose losses feel so total, is not the foundation of what you are. That under the self who has lost is something that has not lost, something that was never born and therefore cannot die, something that the grief, looked at clearly enough all the way to its bottom, begins to reveal. That is what waits at the bottom of Kisa Gotami's road. She cannot see it yet. She is still near the beginning. But it is there. Anatta. Not the end of love, the liberation of love from the fear of losing it. She was beginning to walk toward that. She did not know it yet. She only knew that the floor was gone and she was, somehow, still standing. Grief does not make everyone gentle. This is important to say. The story of Kisa Gotami is a story of grief that opened, that softened, door by door, into something that could eventually become wisdom. Now, Patacara's story is a story of grief so total that it shattered the operating system entirely, and what grew back in the cleared space was something extraordinary. These are real stories. They are not exceptional in the sense of being impossible. They are exceptional in the sense of being fully realized, fully followed through, fully arrived at their destination. But grief has another face, and if we are going to tell this story honestly, if we are going to follow the teaching all the way to where it actually goes rather than to where we wish it went, we have to spend some time with that other face. Because you know people who have been broken by grief and did not open. You may know this in yourself, some grief from some year that did not soften, that hardened instead, that calcified around the wound and became a permanent feature of the architecture. Not wisdom, not liberation, just the scar tissue of something that was never properly tended, grown so thick that it changed the shape of everything around it. The tradition does not look away from this. The tradition, in fact, gives this face of grief a name and a story. And the story is a cautionary tale, not in the cheap moralistic sense. It is a cautionary tale in the deeper sense, a story that shows you the fork in the road with enough clarity that you can recognize where you are standing when you reach it. Aim is Devadatta. But before Devadatta, before we follow grief into its shadow path, there is another figure this chapter needs to carry, a man who walked into the fire of his own violence and came out the other side as something the tradition considers one of its most extraordinary conversions. His story belongs here because it is the counterpoint not just to Devadatta but to Kisa Gotami too, a demonstration that the path of transformation is not reserved for those who suffer quietly, for those whose grief is sympathetic, and for those whose loss can be neatly categorized as innocent. The path is available even to, especially to, the teaching would say, those who have caused enormous harm. His name was Angulimala. The name means garland of fingers. He had earned it. He was a serial killer, which is not a term the ancient texts use, but it is accurate. He was a man who had murdered, by the time the Buddha encountered him, more than 900 people, and who wore a necklace made of the fingers of his victims as a kind of terrible accounting system. He had been, before all of this, a student of a Brahmin teacher who had turned against him, through jealousy, through a false accusation, through the specific cruelty of a teacher who decides a student has surpassed him and engineers their destruction rather than celebrating it. The teacher told Angulimala that to complete his education he needed to make an offering of 1,000 human fingers. This is not the place to fully examine whether that instruction was real or invented, whether the story is literal history or a teaching device. What matters is what the story contains. A young man, educated, presumably intelligent, with enough philosophical grounding that he had been accepted as a serious student, received a command from an authority he trusted that required him to do something monstrous. And he did it. He went into the forests of Kosala and he killed people, many people, and he kept count. Here's the question the story is actually asking. What does a person who has done this do with the weight of it? Not. What does the grief of a killer look like? Because there is grief there. Not grief that the tradition presents as innocent or sympathetic, not grief that deserves comfort in the same way Kisa Gotami's grief deserves comfort, but grief nonetheless. The grief of someone who has become, through a combination of authority and obedience and the specific human capacity to normalize the unthinkable when it arrives in small enough increments, something he did not intend to become. The grief of a man who has looked at his own hands and understood that he is not recoverable by any ordinary measure. The Buddha walked toward him. This is the part that stops you if you think about it clearly. Angulimala was the most wanted man in Kosala. King Pasenadi had assembled an army to capture or kill him. Ordinary people fled when they heard he was near. And the Buddha, told that Angulimala was in the forest on that road, walked toward him, not because he was naive about what Angulimala had done, not because he had suspended his capacity for moral assessment, but because the teaching he had spent his life developing and transmitting did not include a category of human being for whom transformation was structurally impossible. Angulimala ran toward him, sword drawn, and could not catch him. The Buddha was walking at an ordinary pace and Angulimala was running and could not close the distance. This is one of the places where the tradition uses the language of the miraculous. The Buddha walking at normal speed while Angulimala runs and cannot reach him. But what matters is not the mechanics. What matters is what Angulimala eventually shouted at the teacher who would not be caught. "Stop," the Buddha said. "I have stopped. When will you?" Angulimala stopped and asked what that meant, and the Buddha said, "I have stopped causing harm to living beings. You have not." There is a Pali word for what happened next in Angulimala, for what shifted in him when the Buddha said those words. The word is nibbana. Ni-bhna. You know this word, or you know a version of it, nirvana, in the Sanskrit form that has entered English. And the popular understanding of nibbana is something like the extinction of the self, the blowing out of the candle, the end of desire, and therefore the end of everything that makes life feel like anything at all. That understanding is not wrong exactly, but it is thin. It misses the texture of what the word actually describes. Nibbana in the Pali, the cooling. Not the extinguishing of fire in the sense of annihilation, the cooling of fire in the sense of the moment when what has been burning you, burning others, no, consuming everything it touches, finally stops. The relief of that, the spaciousness of that, the specific bodily immediate quality of what it feels like when the burning stops. Angulimala had been on fire, the fire of violence, yes, but under the violence driving it, the fire of grief, the grief of betrayal by a teacher he had loved, the grief of a young man who had wanted to learn and been weaponized instead, a grief that had nowhere to go except outward, into harm. And when the Buddha stopped on that road and did not flinch and said, I have stopped. When will you? Something in Angulimala felt the beginning of what cooling can feel like. He sat down. He asked to become a monk. Just like that. The tradition records that the other monks were horrified, that they could not believe the Buddha would ordain someone who had killed nearly 1,000 people, that they argued and protested and found the whole thing impossible to accept. And the Buddha said, "Do you see the man in front of you? Or do you see the necklace?" He was ordained, and here is what the tradition records about his subsequent life as a monk, because this is the part that the conversion story usually skips, the part that is not dramatic or cinematic, but is the actual meat of what happened. Angulimala walked through the streets of Savatthi on alms rounds, and people threw things at him. Rocks, garbage, whatever was at hand. And he came back to the monastery bleeding, his robes torn, his bowl broken. And the Buddha said to him, "Bear it. You are experiencing now in this life, in a mitigated form, the consequences of what you have done. Bear it." And he bore it. The grief that had turned outward, the grief that had become a necklace of fingers, was turning inward now. Not as self-punishment, not as flagellation, but as the specific, unglamorous, daily work of accountability, of continuing to live in the world where the consequences of your actions are still present, of walking through the streets and receiving what the streets have to give you. This is the part of the teaching that does not get taught in the soft version. The teaching is not only about receiving compassion, it is about bearing consequences known. It is about the specific discipline of continuing to practice even when practice does not remove the weight but only makes the weight bearable. It is about the difference between relief and rescue. The teaching offers relief, the movement from contracted to open, from burning to cooling. It does not offer rescue, the removal of all consequences, the rewinding of all harm. Angulimala bore it, and in time, not quickly, not dramatically, not in a single afternoon the way popular retellings prefer, he arrived at something the texts describe as genuine liberation. He became, in the technical language of the tradition, an arahant, one who had completed the path, one in whom the fires had genuinely cooled, not suppressed, not redirected, but genuinely cooled. His own verses are in the Theragatha. They are not triumphant, they are quiet. They speak of a man who has looked at what his hands did and has not looked away, and has continued to practice, and has arrived somewhere he could not have predicted from the beginning of the road. Now, hold Angulimala. Now, hold the image of him on that road, stopping because someone finally stopped for him. And now bring in the other name this chapter needs to carry. And because there is a man in this story, a man who was present for most of what the Buddha taught, who had access to the same teaching, the same community, the same teacher, who looked at the fork in the road and went the other way, not because he was less intelligent, not because he was less capable, but because his grief, the specific grief he was carrying, chose hardness rather than opening. Devadatta was the Buddha's cousin. He was also a monk, and by all accounts a genuinely accomplished one. The texts record that he developed real meditative attainments, real depth of practice. He was not a fraud, he was not lazy, and he was not simply coasting on the proximity to his famous cousin. He wanted to lead the Sangha, he believed he should lead it, and the root of that belief, the thing underneath the political maneuvering on, the attempts to split the community, the eventual attempts on the Buddha's life, was something much more ordinary and much more recognizable than ambition. He wanted to be seen by someone who was looking at everyone equally, loved the same person that the whole world loved. And in that enormous love, in that original love of cousin for cousin, student for teacher, younger man for older man who seemed to have cracked the code of existence, in that love was the grief of feeling perpetually beside the point, of being the second name, and of pouring yourself into practice and finding that the acknowledgement you needed, the specific seenness that would have made all of it feel worth it, was distributed so broadly that it never quite landed on you in the way you needed it to land. This is the most ordinary wound in the world. The tradition does not excuse Devadatta for what he did with this wound. He attempted murder, he caused a schism in the Sangha, and he took a grief so recognizable that almost every person who has ever loved someone more than they felt loved in return can find themselves in it, and he turned it outward into harm. The teaching is clear that this is a choice, not the same grief that became Kisa Gotami's liberation, the same grief that became Ashoka's welfare state, became Devadatta's downfall, not because he was constitutionally different, because he chose, at the fork in the road, to hold the wound tight rather than to let it breathe. But we will come back to Devadatta. His story has more to reveal than we have time for in this chapter, and some of what it reveals we are not yet ready for. We need a few more chapters of the path before the shadow of it becomes fully visible. For now, hold the fork in the road. Angulimala, who ran toward the teacher with a sword and was stopped by a sentence, and slowly, over years, cooled. Devadatta, who had the teacher as family and had the teaching as daily practice and chose, eventually, the burning. And the teaching does not promise that proximity to wisdom guarantees wisdom. It promises that the capacity for liberation is inherent to every being, but capacity is not destiny. The path requires walking. Mahapajapati Gotami walked it. She was the Buddha's aunt, his father's second wife, the woman who had raised him after his mother died 7 days after his birth. She had given him the first yellow robe he ever wore, woven by her own hands, carrying in its making whatever a mother's hands carry when they are making something for a child they have already lost once, and are making a gift for as a kind of reaching across the distance of his renunciation. He had left, not she had stayed. She had managed the palace, raised children, managed the particular grief of a woman whose most important relationship with the child she had raised from infancy had been restructured, at his choosing, into something she did not ask for and could not refuse. When Siddhartha became the Buddha, Mahapajapati Gotami became, whether she chose it or not, the mother of something larger than a son. She asked to ordain, and 3 times she asked, and 3 times the Buddha said no. Not because he thought women incapable. The eventual tradition of bhikkhunis, ordained nuns, would prove otherwise. But for reasons the commentaries debate and the tradition has wrestled with, he hesitated 3 times, and Ananda intervened. Ananda, always Ananda, walking toward the people the formal structure doesn't quite know what to do with. Asked the Buddha directly, are women capable of attaining liberation through the path? The Buddha said yes. Ananda said, and why does Mahapajapati Gotami not have access to the path? And the Buddha, to his credit, changed his answer. She was ordained. She became the first bhikkhuni, the first ordained nun in the Buddhist tradition. She was, at that point, old. The texts suggest she was elderly when she finally received ordination, which means she had spent a significant portion of her adult life asking for a thing she believed was hers to have and being told no. A grief of that, the particular grief of waiting, of being told that what you know yourself capable of is not available to you, is its own kind of weight. And she carried it to the other side. Her death is recorded in the Mahavagga with a specificity that suggests the community knew they were witnessing something rare. She died, it is said, in the company of 500 ordained nuns, after announcing her own death in advance, after saying her farewells with the calm of someone who has arrived somewhere and knows it. She is said to have attained parinibbana, the final nibbana, the cooling that does not return, on the same day as the Buddha's own demise in some tellings or shortly after, a gesture that the tradition reads as the completion of a relationship that had begun before either of them had words for it. There is a line in her own teaching, preserved, as Kisa Gotami's verses are preserved in the Therigatha, that stays with me. She says, what was to be done has been done. Not, I am at peace, not, I have understood, what was to be done has been done. The language of a woman who approached the spiritual life with the same practicality with which she had managed a palace, raised a future Buddha, asked 3 times for something she deserved and was told no. the language of a woman who had a task and completed it and put it down. The nibbana at the end of her road was not the absence of everything, it was the completion of something. And the cooling of a fire that had been burning not destructively, as in Devadatta, not through harm, but through the heat of living fully in a life that had not been easy and had been met with everything she had. This is what fire does to a woman who refuses to be consumed by it. It tempers her. There is a woman in this story who arrived at the teaching by a completely different road than any of the women we have met so far. She did not lose a child. She did not lose a husband or parents or the entire structure of her life in a single afternoon. She did not arrive at Jetavana in crisis with torn clothing and empty hands and the specific expression of someone who has been undone and beyond the capacity of ordinary language to describe. She arrived in a palanquin. Her name was Kima. She was a queen, the principal queen of King Bimbisara of Magadha, one of the most powerful rulers in northern India, a man who was himself one of the Buddha's most devoted lay supporters. She was known, throughout the kingdom and beyond it, for her beauty. Not in the vague, general way that powerful women are sometimes described as beautiful, but specifically, particularly in the way that people traveled to see. She was the kind of beautiful that becomes its own kind of trap. That becomes the thing you are rather than a thing you have. She had no interest in the Buddha's teaching. This is worth saying plainly. And she was not secretly spiritual, not secretly yearning for something more meaningful than palace life. She was, by the accounts of the commentaries, entirely comfortable in her world, in her beauty, in her status, in the pleasures of a life organized around the cultivation of aesthetic refinement. She was not suffering in any way she could name. She was not looking for a door. She did not want a door. No, her husband wanted her to hear the teaching. He had been trying to bring her to see the Buddha for years, and she had found, not with the skill of someone who has never had to refuse anything directly because her indirect refusals always work, ways not to go. She had heard that the Buddha taught about impermanence, about the unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence, about the body as a source of suffering rather than pleasure, and she was not interested in a teaching that would require her to feel differently about the thing she considered her primary asset. And then the king arranged for her to be carried past Jetavana in her palanquin, on a route that seemed accidental, on a day when the Buddha was teaching in the garden. And she looked, and the Buddha saw her looking. What happened next is one of the most unusual moments in the entire canon, and I want to tell it to you carefully because it is easy to misread. The Buddha used his psychic powers. The tradition records that he manifested a vision of a beautiful woman, more beautiful even than Kima herself, and showed her that woman aging rapidly. The bloom leaving the face, the skin losing its quality of luminosity, the body slowly failing in the specific ways that bodies fail. The woman in the vision aged through decades in moments. Then she was dead, and Kima watched. Now here is how not to read this. This is not the Buddha telling Kima that beauty is worthless. It is not a punishment for vanity. It is not a man telling a woman that her attachment to her appearance is specifically problematic in a way that a man's attachment to his power or his wisdom is not. That reading is available if you are looking for it, and it would be a misreading. What the Buddha showed Kima was not that beauty is bad. He showed her what beauty does when it is held as the ground of the self. He showed her the grief that waits at the end of the road for anyone, male or female, beautiful or plain, queen or beggar, who has built their sense of who they are on a foundation that time will dismantle. And he showed her the teaching she needed in the form she could actually receive it, not as doctrine, not as a list of the 3 marks of existence, but as a vision of the specific thing she was most afraid to look at. She had not known she was afraid. That is the nature of the grief she was carrying. It was not felt as grief yet. It was felt as comfort, as certainty, as the solid ground of her identity. But underneath the comfort was the knowledge, unexamined, unspoken, carefully managed, that the ground was temporary, that the beauty was mortal, that the thing on which she had built the entire architecture of her sense of self was going to be taken from her, slowly or quickly, with or without her permission. No, the Pali word for this, for the specific attachment that Hema was releasing when the vision landed in her chest, is upadana, which you have already heard in this story. Clinging, taking up of something as the foundation of the self. You can cling to a person as Kisa Gotami clung to her son. You can cling to an identity as Kima clung to her beauty. You can cling to a worldview, to a status, to a version of yourself that was true once and has been outgrown but not yet relinquished. The object of the clinging varies enormously. The structure of the clinging is always the same. Kima saw the vision. She felt the landing of it in her chest, the specific internal event that the tradition describes as the arising of insight, which is not a pleasant sensation, not the warm glow of confirmation, but the particular vertiginous quality of a truth that reorganizes things. The floor shifting, the thing you were certain of becoming uncertain, the ground revealing itself as ground, which means revealing itself as something you are standing on. She asked to ordain. Not immediately, not in the dramatic, instant conversion of a story that is more interested in the arc than in the texture of how change actually works. Over time, she heard the teaching that day and it landed, and she went home and lived with the landing. Eventually, the landing became a direction and she followed it. She became one of the foremost teachers among the bhikkhunis. Her specific designation in the canon is that she was foremost in wisdom. Not in psychic powers, like Upalavana. Not in the loving administration of the Sangha, like Mahapajapati. In wisdom, in the specific precision-tooled capacity to see clearly and to transmit what she saw in ways that could be received. And what she saw and what she taught was precisely what the vision had shown her, the nature of the self that clings, and what becomes possible when the clinging releases. Now let me bring in another woman, from a completely different position in the social world of ancient India, whose grief was different in texture from Kima's, but whose liberation arrived by a surprisingly similar road. Her name was Ambapali. She was a courtesan, the most famous courtesan of Vaisali, which was one of the great republican city-states of ancient India, a place known for its wealth and culture and the particular sophistication of its pleasure district. Ambapali was not merely a sex worker in the sense that the word might imply in a contemporary context, and she was something closer to what the Japanese tradition would later call a geisha in its original sense, a woman of artistic accomplishment, musical skill, conversational brilliance, and yes, sexual availability, whose company was sought by kings and merchants and philosophers, and whose social position was, paradoxically, both outside the normal structure of respectable society and more powerful within that structure than most respectable women ever managed to achieve. She was, like Kima, celebrated for her beauty. She was wealthy, fabulously, extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of her era. She had a son who became a monk, which is how she first encountered the Sangha, and she did something that shocked the nobles of Vaisali when she found out the Buddha was passing through. She invited the entire Sangha to her mango grove for a meal, and she offered the grove itself, an enormous and valuable piece of property, as a gift to the community. The nobles were furious. They had wanted to invite the Buddha themselves and had been outbid, essentially, by a woman whose social position they considered beneath them. They offered Ambapali enormous sums to give up her invitation. She refused. The Buddha came to her grove, ate the meal she had prepared, and received the gift of the property with the same uncomplicated graciousness with which he received gifts from kings. But the poem that Ambapali left in the Therigatha, that is the thing I want to stay with. None. She wrote it in old age, and it is a catalogue of what time had done to her body, the specific, unflinching inventory of a woman who had made her living through her physical appearance and was now recording, line by line, what that appearance had become. The hair that had been thick and fragrant and black, now sparse, rough to the touch. The eyes that had been bright, dimmed. The teeth that had been white and even, broken. The skin that had been smooth, now loose, the glow gone entirely. The body that had drawn the attention of kings, now bent and slow. She catalogues it all, without bitterness, without nostalgia, and without the performance of acceptance that is actually just bitterness in a better outfit. She records what was and what is now, and at the end of each catalog she says the same phrase. Such is the nature of this body, the teaching of truth. This is the teaching of truth. Not the body was an illusion. Not I was wrong to have the body I had. Not beauty was a trap and I was foolish to value it. The body was real. The beauty was real. The pleasure she took in it and that she gave through it was real, and now it is gone in the specific way that real things go, and she is looking at that clearly and finding that the looking is itself the teaching. There is a word in Pali for what Ambapali achieved through that poem, through the act of sitting with the inventory of her own aging body and writing it down without flinching. The word is panya, wisdom, not the abstract wisdom of correct doctrine, not the wisdom of someone who has studied the texts and can recite the right answers. Panya is the wisdom of direct seeing, the kind that comes when you have looked at the specific thing you were most afraid to look at, fully and without turning away, until the looking itself becomes the liberation. Ambapali saw her own aging body. Kima saw the vision of beauty becoming dust. Kisa Gotami saw the inside of 50 houses where someone had died. The object of the seeing is different in each case. The quality of the seeing, direct, unfiltered, without the protective gauze of what we wish were true, is the same. Now here is someone who arrived at the teaching from a completely different direction, through power rather than beauty, through the specific vertigo of someone who had organized their entire sense of safety around wealth and position, and then sat across from a teacher who had walked away from both. His name was King Bimbisara, Kima's own husband, the ruler of Magadha. He had met the Buddha before the Enlightenment, when Siddhartha was still a wandering ascetic, still searching, still in the years between his departure from the palace and his arrival under the Bodhi tree. And he had been struck even then by something in the young man that he could not quite name. A quality of determination, perhaps, or of genuine quest. The specific bearing of someone who is looking for something real rather than performing the search. He had offered Siddhartha half his kingdom. Siddhartha had declined, politely, and continued walking. When the Buddha returned, after the Enlightenment, King Bimbisara was among the first people he taught. And the teaching that landed for him, the specific door that opened, was not about grief in the way we have been using that word. It was about something adjacent to grief, something that lives in the same neighborhood. It was about the fear that lives inside power, because power is its own kind of attachment. Man who has organized his life around the safety that power provides, the safety of being the one who decides, the one who cannot easily be touched, the one whose word is the last word in any room he enters, is carrying a grief of his own, the grief of knowing at some level that the safety is not real, that everything the power protects can still be taken, that the king is not exempt from the marks of existence, that even the most powerful person in the room will eventually be carried out of it. Bimbisara knew this. It was the thing he had not been able to say in any room full of ministers and generals and advisors who needed him to be certain. And then he sat across from a man who had walked away from a kingdom and found something that could not be taken. And the grief he had been carrying in silence for years had somewhere to go. Now, here is the modern bridge that belongs in this chapter. Your brain does not distinguish between a broken heart and a broken bone. This is not a metaphor. The anterior, cingulate cortex, the region of the brain responsible for processing physical pain, is the same region that activates when you experience social loss. The same neural pathways, the the same signals, the same neurological architecture that fires when you stub your toe fires when someone you love dies, when a relationship ends, when you are excluded, when you lose the thing that made you feel like yourself. Neuroscientists studying grief in the past 2 decades have found something that the Buddha's teaching anticipated by 2,500 years. That grief is not primarily a cognitive event. It is not primarily about what you think, about the story you tell, about the intellectual processing of loss. It is a whole-body event. It lives in the chest and the stomach and the throat, and it lives in the heaviness of the limbs and the exhaustion that grief produces. Not the tiredness of having done too much, but the tiredness of the body processing something enormous at a cellular level. This is why the Buddha's instruction to Kisa Gotami, go, walk, knock on doors, was not arbitrary. It was not simply a pedagogical device designed to produce an insight. It was, in neurological terms, precisely correct. Movement is one of the primary ways the body processes grief, not suppresses it, not avoids it, processes it, allows the physiological event of grief to move through the nervous system rather than becoming stuck in it. And the walking was the medicine. The task was the treatment. And this is why sitting across from someone who does not flinch, who receives your grief with the quality of attention that Ananda showed Kisa Gotami, that the Buddha showed Angulimala, that Sariputta showed the dying Anathapindika, is not merely a kindness. It is, in neurological terms, co-regulation. The nervous system of a distressed person will, when in the presence of a calm and attuned other, begin to entrain to that calm. Not immediately, not magically, but measurably actually in the body. The tradition knew this without the vocabulary of neuroscience, and knew it in the body, which is where knowledge of this kind lives before it has words. What Kema was released from, what Ambapali saw clearly in the mirror of her own aging, what Bimbisara found across from the man who had refused his kingdom, all of it is the same movement. The movement from contracted to open, from defended to present, from the burning of clinging to the cooling of seeing clearly. And Panya, the wisdom that is not learned but lived into. And somewhere in the lineage of transmission that runs from that garden in Savatthi to wherever you are right now, something of that wisdom is still moving, still warm, still doing what it did when Faxian walked through those villages and heard the story at every way stop, still landing. There is a refuge that most people forget. You have probably heard, if you have spent any time around Buddhist teaching, about the 3 refuges. The 3 things that a practitioner turns toward when the ordinary structures of life are not enough. The first is the Buddha, not as a supernatural being to whom you petition for rescue, but as a human being who walked the same ground you walk and found the way through. The second is the Dhamma, the teaching, the path, a body of understanding that points toward what the Buddha found. These 2 refuges are well known. They get talked about, they get written about. There are entire libraries built around them. The third refuge is the Sangha, and the Sangha, the community of practitioners, the people who are walking the same road in the same direction, sometimes together and sometimes in parallel and sometimes at what feels like an impossible distance from each other. The Sangha is the one that gets forgotten, the one that gets treated as peripheral, as organizational, as the administrative scaffolding around the real spiritual content. People come for the first refuge and the second. They tolerate the third, or they avoid it entirely, preferring the version of practice that can be done alone, in private, without the inconvenience of other people and their own textures of difficulty. This is understandable. Other people are difficult. Community is difficult. The Sangha is difficult. Anyone who has spent time in a meditation community, in any spiritual community of any tradition, knows that proximity to people who are all trying to practice does not automatically produce harmony. It produces, in fact, a remarkable concentration of every human difficulty. The hierarchies, the resentments, the people who talk too much in Dharma discussions, the people who claim more attainment than they have, the quiet ones who are either deeply realized or deeply withdrawn, and you cannot always tell which. Community is a crucible. It was never designed to be comfortable. But here is what it is underneath all of that. It is the container. And you cannot. This is something the tradition understood in its bones, long before the neuroscience of social connection arrived to confirm it. You cannot complete the transformation alone. You can begin alone. You can practice alone. You can have genuine insights alone, in the quiet of early morning before anyone else is awake, in the specific stillness that belongs to solitary practice. The insight that is not held by a community tends to evaporate. It tends to be reabsorbed into the ordinary life, into the ordinary self, into the ordinary patterns of reactivity and avoidance, and the small, comfortable lies we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do. The container holds the heat. Without the container, the heat disperses. Kisa Gotami needed the Sangha. She had gone to the Buddha alone. Because the Buddha is where you go when you are completely undone and you need something that nothing else can provide. But what she needed after the Buddha, after the mustard seed, after the empty hands, after the first crack opened in the wall of her grief, was not another individual encounter with an extraordinary teacher. What she needed was ordinary people. People who were also practicing, people who were also carrying things, people who had also been to some version of 50 doors and come back with empty hands and were now slowly, painfully, without drama or enlightenment on schedule, learning what to do with empty hands. She needed the company of people who were going in the same direction. Now let me bring in a woman whose story belongs here. Not because she had the same grief as Kisa Gotami, not because her path was identical, but because she demonstrates what the third refuge actually looks like when it is functioning the way it is supposed to function. Her name was Visakha. She was one of the most significant female lay supporters of the early Sangha. The tradition places her alongside Anathapindika as one of the two great lay supporters of the community, one male and one female, and each contributing something different. She was wealthy, practically minded, deeply devoted, and possessed of the specific gift of people who combine genuine faith with organizational intelligence. She knew not only that the Sangha needed support, but how to provide it, in what form, at what scale, with what consistency. One day she came to the Buddha with her face wet with tears. She had just lost someone, a granddaughter she had loved deeply, a young woman whose death had been sudden and unexpected and had landed in Visakha with the specific force that losses land when you have not been braced for them. The armor of awareness that long experience with impermanence eventually provides has not yet been pulled into place. The Buddha asked her, "How many people live in Savatthi?" She told him, "Tens of thousands, perhaps. A large city." He asked her, "Would you like to have as many children and grandchildren as there are people in Savatthi?" She said, "Yes, of course. Why would I not?" He said, "And how many of those people do you think I in Savatthi each day?" She was quiet. He said, "If you had as many children and grandchildren as there are people in this city, how many of them do you think would die in a year?" She understood what he was doing. She had been doing the math as he was speaking. She said, "Then I would always be wet with tears." He said, "Yes, so do not wish for so many, because then you grieve for so many. Wish for those you have and grieve for those you lose. Know that the grief is real and the loss is real, and also that you are not alone in it. This is the third refuge. At its most direct, you are not alone in it. Not as consolation, not as the thing you say to someone to make them feel better temporarily while not actually changing anything. As fact, as the specific, verifiable, and standing right here in front of you fact that the person across from you has also been wet with tears, has also stood at the door of a room where someone they loved was dying and could not stop the dying, has also woken awoken at 3 in the morning with the weight of something that the daylight hours are better at managing, has also sat in the dust of an empty afternoon with nothing left to hold and nothing left to run toward. Now, you are not alone in it, and knowing that, truly knowing it, in the body, not just as an abstract proposition, but as a lived experience of being with other people who know it too, that knowing changes something. The Mahavamsa, the great Sri Lankan chronicle of the 5th century of the Common Era, records something about the transmission of the teaching that is remarkable. It describes how the Dhamma traveled from India to Sri Lanka, carried by Ashoka's own son Mahinda, who was a monk, and eventually by his daughter Sanghamitta, who brought with her a cutting from the original Bodhi tree, the tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment, and planted it in the ancient capital of Anuradhapura, where it has grown, tended, and protected. Note, for over 2,000 years, that tree is still alive. It is, in fact, the oldest known planted tree in human history with a verified planting date. But the thing the Mahavamsa emphasizes, the thing it returns to again and again in its account of how the teaching established itself in Sri Lanka, is not the text, not the doctrines, not the brilliant exposition of the philosophical system. It is the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns who carried the practice in their bodies, in their daily rhythms, in the specific texture of how they lived together and supported each other and disagreed and reconciled and sat together in the early morning before the sun was up and practiced. That teaching did not survive because it was written down. It survived because people sat together in the dark and passed it forward. Text can be burned. Doctrine can be forgotten. Not a community of people who have learned something in their bodies, who have transmitted it not just in words, but in the quality of their presence and their practice. That is harder to extinguish. The cutting from the Bodhi tree, now carried across the water and planted in new ground, took root because the people who carried it knew how to tend it. The Sangha was the knowledge of how to tend it. Now here is something I want you to feel, not just understand. Enough. Think of a time just once is enough, when you were in the presence of someone who was not trying to fix you, who was not trying to explain your situation to you, or reframe it into something more manageable, or find the silver lining, or remind you of all the things you still had to be grateful for. Someone who was simply present, who sat with you in the difficulty without requiring it to be over, without needing you to be better for their sake, without the subtle pressure of someone who is uncomfortable with your discomfort and is trying to resolve their own discomfort by resolving yours. Now, think of what that felt like in your body, the easing of something, the way you could breathe slightly more fully, the sense not of the problem being solved, but of the problem being held in a space large enough to contain it. The difference between being alone in the difficulty and being accompanied in it. That is the Sangha. That is the third refuge. Not as institution, not as organization, not as the building with the meditation cushions and the schedule on the wall, as the human experience of being accompanied, of being witnessed, of being in the company of people who have agreed, whether explicitly or implicitly, not to go in the same direction and to not leave each other at the roadside when the road gets difficult. The Pali word is Sangha, Sangha, with a specific ning sound that does not quite exist in English, a sound that comes from the back of the throat that has a resonance to it. The word means community, assembly, the community of those who practice, but it also carries, in its etymology, the sense of things coming together, the coming together of individual practitioners into something that is collectively more than the sum of its individual capacities. Alone, you are as strong as you are. With a Sangha, you have access to the accumulated practice, the accumulated understanding, the accumulated capacity for presence of everyone who has ever sat in that direction and learned something, not as a mystical inheritance, as a practical one. You learn from watching someone who has been practicing longer than you how to sit with difficulty without immediately reaching for a way out of it. And you learn from someone who has been through grief that is comparable to yours that it is possible to come through. You learn, and this is the most practical thing, the hardest, that your particular way of making yourself the center of your own suffering is not unique. That the specific story you tell yourself about why your loss is worse than other losses. 9. Why your grief is more legitimate. Why the path that works for other people will not work for you because your situation is different. That story is one the Sangha has heard before, is hearing right now in 100 different versions. The Sangha holds up a mirror, not always a comfortable one. Now, there is a question I planted in this story several chapters back, and I want to name it explicitly now before we close this chapter, because we are approaching the place where it will be answered. The question is, what does it mean that the Sangha held Kisa Gotami after her awakening? Not before it, after. When she had already been through the mustard seed, and when she had already laid her son down, when she had already stood in front of the Buddha with empty hands and heard the teaching. Why does it matter that the community was there afterward? Why is the community the container rather than the catalyst? Hold that question. It will be answered. Not yet, but it is the question that the next several chapters are building toward. I don't want you to lose it in the accumulation of story. The Sangha is not peripheral. It is not the social appendage to the real spiritual work. It is the thing that makes the real spiritual work stick. Now, here is the Mahavamsa's account of something that happened centuries after Kisa Gotami's death. Something that I want to offer as the macro version of what the Sangha does for the individual. When the great Theravada tradition came close to extinction in Sri Lanka, in a period of invasion and famine and the destruction of the monasteries, in one of the many dark periods through which any living tradition must eventually pass, it was saved not by a brilliant individual, not by a charismatic teacher who reconstituted the teaching through the force of their own attainment, but by the sending of monks from Burma, from Thailand, from the other places where the lineage had taken root, re-established the ordination lineage that had been broken. A community saved a community. A Sangha reached across the water to re-establish a Sangha. The teaching had been preserved in the bodies of practitioners who had received it from practitioners who had received it from practitioners who had received it, in an unbroken chain of transmission, people who sat with the Buddha in Jetavana, from the community that held Kisa Gotami after the mustard seed. This is the third refuge at full scale, and there is one more woman in this chapter who needs to be here, because her story is the personal version of what the Mahavamsa records at the historical scale. Patacara. You have not forgotten her. I told you I had not forgotten her either. She came to Jetavana out of her mind, torn clothing, incoherent, the specific expression of someone who has moved beyond the capacity of language to contain what is happening to them. The Buddha called her back to herself. And then, and this is the part the story usually ends on, because the moment of calling is dramatic and the afterward is not, she stayed. She did not go back to wherever she had been. There was nothing to go back to. She stayed in the Sangha. She sat with the other practitioners. She practiced in the company of people who were also practicing. She ate the meals, followed the schedule, sat in the early morning and the evening with the other bhikkhunis, learned the Dhamma in the company of people who were also learning it. And over time, not in a single afternoon, not in a dramatic conversion experience, but over the long, ordinary time of daily practice in a community that held her, something grew back. Not the same thing that had been destroyed, something new, something that had not been possible before the destruction, that could only have grown in the specific soil that total loss creates. She became a teacher, one of the greatest teachers of the Theragatha, and the texts record that women came to her specifically with their grief. Women who had lost children, women who had lost husbands, and women who had been undone by loss in the specific ways that women in that world were undone. and that she received them, that she sat with them the way she had been sat with, that the community she had needed became the community she provided. The Sangha had caught her, and then she had become the Sangha. This is how it works. This is what the third refuge actually means, when it is functioning rather than merely being named. If what you have heard tonight is landing somewhere useful, if the image of Patacara finding her way back, or Visakha in the garden, or the Bodhi tree growing for 2,000 years in ground where someone had the foresight to plant it, if any of that is finding a place in you it recognizes, consider subscribing. It is the small thing that allows these stories to continue finding the people who need them. Thank you. And now, back to the road she is still walking. Not everyone who suffered turned toward the light. You know this. You have seen it. You have watched someone go through something genuinely terrible, a loss as real as any loss we have described in this story, grief as legitimate as Kisa Gotami's grief, pain as specific and irreducible as Patacara's pain, and come out the other side harder, smaller, more defended, as though the experience of suffering, rather than opening them, had confirmed something they already suspected about the world, that it was not to be trusted, that other people were not to be trusted, that the only sensible response to a world that takes things from you is to grip more tightly the things you still have and regard everything else with suspicion. You may know this pull in yourself. It is important to say that, not as accusation, as recognition. The pull toward hardness after loss is not a character flaw. It is a response. It is the self-protective instinct of a nervous system that has been injured and does not want to be injured again. It is entirely understandable. It is, in some contexts and in moderate doses, adaptive. The appropriate tightening of boundaries after a boundary has been violated. The appropriate caution after a trust has been broken. But there is a point at which protection becomes prison, at which the walls built to keep the pain out begin to keep everything else out too, and at which the self that was protecting itself from further loss has become so defended that it cannot receive the things that make life worth living. Connection, surprise, a capacity to be genuinely moved by something outside yourself. At which grief, unprocessed and unchallenged and never allowed to open, has curdled into something else entirely. That is the fork in the road. No one in this story illustrates it more clearly, more painfully, more instructively than the man this chapter has been waiting to fully examine. His name was Devadatta. And before we go further with his story, I want to ask you to resist the version of him that the tradition sometimes presents. The cartoon villain, the pure antagonist, the one whose role in the story is simply to be wrong so that the Buddha can be right. And that version is not useful and it is not true. The truth about Devadatta is more uncomfortable than that and more instructive precisely because it is more recognizable. He was the Buddha's cousin. They had grown up together in the same palace complex in the same city of Kapilavastu, in the layered proximity of a large aristocratic family where everyone knows everyone, and the relationships carry the particular weight of shared history going back before memory. He had known Siddhartha as a child. He had watched him leave. He had presumably received the news of the Enlightenment with whatever mixture of wonder and something else, something not quite named, not quite allowed to be named, that a cousin receives when a cousin becomes something the whole world comes to kneel before. He ordained, and he became a monk, and he practiced. He was not performing practice. The tradition records that he developed genuine meditative attainments, that he acquired real depth, that he was by any ordinary measure a serious and accomplished practitioner. He was not a fraud, he was not lazy, he was not simply coasting on the proximity to his famous cousin. But here is what the tradition also records, with the kind of candor that makes the Pali Canon worth reading slowly. Devadatta wanted to be the Buddha's successor. He wanted to lead the Sangha. Now, he believed, and this belief was not without its own internal logic, that he had the capacity, the attainment, the understanding to do it. And he asked. The Buddha said, "No, now pay attention here, because this is the moment that the fork appears." The no was not a judgment about Devadatta's practice. It was not the Buddha saying, "You are inadequate, your attainment is insufficient, you are less than you think you are." It was something more complicated than that. A recognition, perhaps, of something in Devadatta's motivation that was not yet clean, not yet free of the specific contaminant that the tradition identifies as one of the most tenacious obstacles on the path. Not greed, exactly. Not hatred, exactly. Something that wears the face of both and is often mistaken for ambition. The Pali word for what was moving in Devadatta underneath his request is mana, pride in the translation. But the Pali carries a more specific meaning than the English word suggests. Mana is the comparing mind. It is the self that cannot simply be what it is, but must constantly measure itself against others, must know whether it is above or below, more or less, recognized or overlooked. Mana is the wound of the self that cannot find its ground in itself and so must continuously find it in comparison. It is at its root the grief of inadequacy, or rather, the grief of someone who has not yet made peace with their own sufficiency. Devadatta had this wound, and the wound had a very specific object, the Buddha himself. He loved the same person that the whole world loved, and he had grown up beside the man who would become the teacher of gods and humans. He had practiced in the community that formed around that man's life and teaching, and in all of that proximity, all of that closeness, all of those years of being in the same rooms and eating the same meals and following the same schedule, he had never quite felt seen. Not in the specific way the wound required, not in the way that would have satisfied the particular hunger that was driving him. Because the Buddha saw all beings equally, that was not a metaphor. That was the actual content of his attainment, the equanimity that made no distinctions, that offered the same quality of attention to a king and a prostitute and a murderer and a cousin. And for Devadatta, that equal seeing was the wound. He wanted to be seen especially. He wanted the recognition that would come from being chosen, designated, elevated above the general equality of the Buddha's regard. He wanted the teacher to say, "Of all the people I have known and taught, you are the one." The teacher could not say that, not because Devadatta was unworthy, because it was not true, and because saying it would not have healed the wound. The wound was not the absence of recognition. The wound was the need for it. Here's the part that lands differently at 3 in the morning. You have felt a version of this. Most people have. And the specific grief of loving someone enormously. A parent, a teacher, a partner, a friend. And feeling that the love you have for them is not quite matched by the way they see you. And the ache of being in the presence of someone whose attention you want more than you want most things, and finding that their attention is distributed so broadly, so equally, so without the particular focus you need, that it never quite lands on you in the right way. This is not a shameful feeling, it is a human feeling. It is the feeling of someone whose attachment has not yet found its ground in something more stable than another person's gaze. What Devadatta did with that feeling is where the story becomes a warning. He tried to take by force what would not come as gift. He went to King Ajatasattu, Bimbisara's son, a young man susceptible to flattery and to the intoxication of power, and he aligned himself with the prince's ambitions. He requested a formal split of the Sangha. He proposed rules so strict that the Buddha would not accept them, engineering a situation in which Devadatta could present himself as the more serious practitioner, the one who required more of the community, the one who was not softened by comfort and compromise. He took 500 monks with him when the split came. He organized 3 attempts on the Buddha's life. None of them succeeded, not because the Buddha was supernaturally protected, but because the attempts were, in the end, the actions of a man who had lost the thread of his own practice and was operating entirely from the contracted, the defended space of grievance and need. The 500 monks who had followed Devadatta eventually returned to the Sangha. Sariputta and Moggallana, the 2 chief disciples, the ones whose practical wisdom was second only to the Buddha's, went to where the monks were and taught them, and they came back, not because they were coerced, and because the teaching that Devadatta had been offering them was emptier than what they had left, and they could feel the difference. The Pali word for what was missing from Devadatta's teaching, the thing that made it hollow despite his genuine attainments, is phassa, sense contact. No, the point where the inner and outer world meet, where what is inside you touches what is actually here, outside, in the room, in the other person, in the reality of the present moment. Phassa is the first link in the chain of dependent origination, the moment of contact that gives rise to feeling, which gives rise to craving, which gives rise to clinging, which gives rise to all the forms of suffering. But phassa, properly understood, is also the site of liberation, because it is at the point of contact, at the moment when inside meets outside, when the self meets the world, that you have the choice. The choice of how to respond, the choice of whether to let the contact open you or close you, whether the thing that touches you becomes the beginning of clinging or the beginning of seeing. And Devadatta's grief had closed him at the point of contact. The no he received from the Buddha, reasonable, considered, not cruel, had touched him at the place where the wound already was, and he had let it close. He had taken the closing and built a fortress out of it, and called the fortress righteousness, and spent years defending it. This is the shadow path, not the path of obvious wrongdoing, not the path of someone who never tried, and the path of someone who tried seriously, who practiced genuinely, who had real capacity, and who let a wound that was never fully examined, never fully opened, never brought into the light of the kind of attention the Buddha had tried to offer equally to everyone, including him. Let that wound make the decisions. Now, here is the thing that the tradition offers about Devadatta that most retellings omit. He did not die in hatred. The Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's past lives, include a prophecy attributed to the Buddha himself that Devadatta would eventually become a Pratyeka Buddha, a solitary Buddha, one who attains full liberation without becoming a teaching Buddha, without the mission of transmission. In some future life, time, the tradition does not specify, the same capacity that Devadatta had, the genuine depth of practice, the real attainment that was always there underneath the wound, would complete itself. This is not a sentimental ending. It is not the tradition saying that what Devadatta did didn't matter, that the harm was not real, that the schism and the attempts at murder were acceptable because he would eventually be okay. No. It is the tradition saying something harder and more important, that the capacity for liberation is inherent, that no one falls so far that the path is permanently closed, that the wound that drives the shadow path is still a wound, which means it is still alive, which means it can still heal. The grief that drove Devadatta into harm was real grief, and the wound of not being seen in the way he needed to be seen, that is a real wound. The teaching is not that the wound invalidates the person. The teaching is that the wound, unexamined, unchallenged, defended rather than opened, will make choices on behalf of the whole person. It will override the genuine attainment and the genuine practice and the genuine capacity, and it will drive the car. The only answer to that is the mustard seed, is the 50 doors. None is the choice. And it is always a choice, even when it does not feel like one, to let the grief breathe instead of building walls around it. Devadatta did not make that choice in this life, but the path was not permanently closed. The Pali word Vedana, Vedana, feeling tone, describes the quality of experience that arises at the moment of phassa, of contact. Every moment of experience has a Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The moment of contact with the Buddha's no was unpleasant for Devadatta. This is not a failing. Unpleasant Vedana is part of existence. The question is what arises after it, and whether the unpleasant feeling tone generates craving, the craving to push away the unpleasant, to fight it, to defeat it, to make it stop by force, or whether it generates something else. A willingness to sit with the unpleasant feeling and find out what it actually is, what it is made of, what is underneath it. Kisa Gotami sat with unpleasant Vedana at 50 doors. Devadatta reached for his sword. That is the fork. That is always the fork. And you are standing at some version of it right now. Not perhaps as dramatically, not perhaps with armies and assassination attempts, but in the smaller daily versions that are no less consequential for being small. The moment someone says no to something you needed, the moment you are passed over for something you believed was yours, known. The moment the attention you wanted lands somewhere else. The moment the recognition you worked for goes to someone who did not work as hard. What do you do with it? Not what should you do. What do you actually do in the body in the first moment after the contact? What is the quality of the Vedana and what arises after it? You do not have to have the answer. The teaching does not ask you to have performed the practice already before you begin it. It asks you to notice. Just notice what closes, what hardens, what the instinct is before the deliberate response. Notice it, and this is the whole practice condensed into a single instruction. Choose again. That is what Devadatta could not do, and that is what you can. There is a question that powerful people carry in silence, not because they do not have it. They have it more acutely than most, a specific way that people who have organized their entire lives around the avoidance of vulnerability tend to have the questions they are avoiding most acutely of all. And the question lives in them the way unexploded ordnance lives in a field, buried, unmarked, quietly present, not exerting a kind of gravitational influence on everything that grows around it without ever quite being acknowledged as the thing it is. The question is, what happens when it is taken from me? Not the possessions, not the status, not that whole configuration of power and recognition that constitutes a life organized around external achievement. The deeper question, the one underneath all the others, the one that the powerful man and the destitute woman and the celebrated queen and the street sweeper all share equally in the early hours of the morning when sleep will not come. Not what happens when I lose the thing I cannot bear to lose. What happens when the ground gives way? What happens when the armor is not enough and the thing I have been protecting myself from arrives anyway? King Pasenadi of Kosala was one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. He ruled a large and prosperous kingdom, commanded armies, controlled trade routes, made alliances through marriage and diplomacy with the other great powers of his era. He was, by any external measure, a man who had solved the problem of vulnerability, who had accumulated enough power and enough of the markers of permanence that the ordinary anxieties of ordinary life should not have been able to reach him. He came to the Buddha and he asked directly the question that powerful people are not supposed to ask. He said, "Is there anything in this world that cannot be lost?" And the Buddha, who had himself walked away from a kingdom and therefore could answer from experience rather than theory, said, "Yes, but you will not find it where you have been looking." Pasenadi was not naive, no, been ruling long enough to know that kingdoms fall, that alliances fail, that the body of a king ages at exactly the same rate as the body of a farmer, and he had attended enough deaths of people he trusted to understand that proximity to power does not exempt you from the ordinary arithmetic of existence. He knew all of this intellectually. He knew it the way most of us know the things that we have not yet been required to feel. He came to the Buddha not to be told what he already knew. He came to be shown how to know it differently, and how to hold the knowledge of impermanence in a way that was not merely the fear of loss dressed up as philosophical acceptance, but something actually free, something that had genuinely come to terms, not just reached a truce. This is the question that every person in this story has been asking, in their own register, in their own language, from their own particular point of contact with the truth of impermanence. Not Kisa Gotami asked it with a dead child in her arms and 50 doors that would not give her what she needed. Patacara asked it from the rubble of a single afternoon that destroyed everything. Devadatta asked it in the worst possible way, by demanding the answer instead of walking toward it. And now a king is asking it in the most direct way it has perhaps ever been asked in this story, sitting across from the teacher, and with all his power visible and all his fear also visible if you know how to look, and saying, "Is there anything that cannot be lost?" The Milindapana, the questions of King Milinda, one of the great non-canonical texts of the Theravada tradition, dialogue between a Greek king and a Buddhist monk that took place perhaps 2 centuries after the Buddha's death, contains an exchange that goes to the heart of what Pasenadi was asking. King Milinda, the Greek ruler of Bactria, came to the monk Nagasena with the questions that his Greek philosophical training had made available to him. Precise, logical, pressing on the exact points where the doctrine seemed to contradict itself. He asked, "You speak of a person who practices and attains liberation, but you also say there is no self. So who is it who practices, who attains? If there is no self, who walks the path?" Nagasena said, "Let me ask you something. You came here in a chariot. Is the chariot the wheels?" Milinda said no. Nagasena said, "Is it the axle?" No. "Is it the frame, the reins, the pole, the yoke?" Wheels together with the axle and the frame and the reins and the pole and the yoke? No to all of them. "Is the chariot something apart from all of these components?" No. Then Nagasena said, "Is there a chariot at all?" Milinda was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The chariot is a conventional designation, a name that arises in dependence on the coming together of the components. There is no chariot apart from the components and their relationship. The name is convenient and real in that sense, but the chariot is not an independently existing thing," Nagasena said. "Exactly. And so it is with the self." Note, the self is a conventional designation, a name that arises in dependence on the coming together of body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. There is no self apart from these and their relationship. Name is convenient and real in that sense, but the self is not an independently existing thing that could be said to practice or attain in the way you are imagining. What practices is the process. What attains is the process. The river reaches the sea, and no single water molecule makes the whole journey. And the river is real, and the reaching is real, and the sea is real. What is this for Pasenadi? What is it for you? If the self is a process rather than a thing, if what you call yourself is a river rather than a stone, then the question what happens when it is taken from me begins to shift, not to dissolve, not to become unimportant. The loss is still real. The grief is still real. The pain of losing specific people and specific configurations of your life is not made abstract by the recognition that the self is a process. But the quality of what is at stake changes. What can be taken is the particular configuration, the specific arrangement of causes and conditions that constitutes this version of the river at this moment. What cannot be taken is the capacity for the river to flow. The Pali word for what Pasenadi was beginning to touch in that conversation is jnana, direct knowledge. Not the knowledge of having heard something and understood it, not even the knowledge of having thought about it carefully and arrived at intellectual agreement. Jnana is the knowing that settles in the body, that changes the quality of the breath, that is not locatable in the head but seems to come from somewhere more central. It is the knowing that Kisa Gotami arrived at somewhere between the 40th and the 50th door, not because someone explained it to her, but because she had walked far enough into the direct experience of impermanence that the knowing had nowhere left to go except in. You have had this. Not about impermanence necessarily, about something. No, there has been something in your life that you knew before you knew it. Something that arrived not as a thought but as a recognition, as the experience of a truth landing in the body before the mind has finished processing it. A relationship that you knew was over before you were ready to say so. A job that you knew had run its course. A version of yourself that you knew had been outgrown. The jnana arrived before the decision did. And looking back, you knew it was accurate, precisely because it came from below the level where we manage and curate and negotiate our experience. That is the level the teaching is pointed at. Now here is the historical figure who understood this at the scale of an entire civilization. Not through personal loss, not through the intimate grief of Kisa Gotami or the totalizing grief of Patacara, but through the kind of seeing clearly that comes when you have spent enough years watching human beings exercise power, that you finally see the pattern underneath all the particular instances. His name was Ledi Sayadaw, and he was a Burmese monk who lived in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of extraordinary instability for Buddhism in Burma, as the British colonial administration systematically dismantled the structures of the monarchy that had supported and protected the Sangha for centuries. The monasteries that had been the primary institutions of learning and practice were losing their patronage, and the tradition that had been maintained through an elaborate network of royal support and community obligation was suddenly exposed, vulnerable in ways it had not been for a very long time. Ledi Sayadaw looked at what was happening, and he made a decision that was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential decisions in the history of Theravada Buddhism. He decided to give the teaching to lay people, not a simplified version, not a diluted one. The actual teaching, the full practice of vipassana meditation, insight meditation, a direct investigation of the three marks of existence in the living experience of the body, had traditionally been the province of monks, of people who had ordained and left the householder life and committed themselves to the full-time pursuit of practice. Lay people supported the Sangha, attended teachings, practiced generosity and ethical conduct, but the deep practice, the meditation that led to direct insight, that was for monastics, Ledi Sayadaw said. The monasteries may not survive the century. If the teaching lives only in the monasteries, the teaching may not survive either. It must be planted in the soil of ordinary life, in the households of farmers and merchants and mothers, in the people who wake before dawn to begin their work and fall asleep after the children are settled. It must be available to people who cannot ordain, who have families and fields and the specific obligations of lives embedded in the world. He began teaching lay people vipassana. This was not a small thing. It was in its way as radical as Mahapajapati's ordination. The extension of the full teaching to a category of people who had been told it was not quite for them, and the consequences were enormous. The lay vipassana movement that Ledi Sayadaw started, carried forward by his students, and their students, across Burma and eventually across the ocean to the west, is directly responsible for the fact that you have access to these teachings right now, wherever you are, in whatever form they have reached you. He looked at civilizational grief, the grief of a tradition that might not survive, and his response was the same response Ashoka had to personal grief, the same response Kisa Gotami had to maternal grief, the same response the Mahavamsa records the Sangha making to the near extinction of the lineage in Sri Lanka. He moved forward. He did the specific, practical, unglamorous thing that the situation required. He planted seeds in new ground. The Pali word for what Ledi Sayadaw had in sufficient quantity to make this choice rather than the easier choice of maintaining the tradition as it had been and hoping it would survive, is Panya again, wisdom. But here in a different register than Ambapali's wisdom or Kima's wisdom. Here as the wisdom of a man who could see clearly enough to act from what he saw, rather than from what he wished were true, or what the tradition prescribed, or what would have been safer for his own reputation and standing. Wisdom that sees clearly enough to act on what it sees, even when what it sees is unwelcome. Now, here is the modern bridge that belongs in this chapter. In 261 BCE, the Kalinga War ended and Ashoka built hospitals. In the 19th century, Ledi Sayadaw extended the teaching to lay people because the institutions might not survive. And in these decades now, the transmission continues outward in 100 different forms, this voice among them, because the grief that generates wisdom and the wisdom that responds to grief have not stopped being true. And each of these is a version of the same response, the The recognition that what has been received must be transmitted, that the teaching does not belong to the conditions that gave rise to it, that the grief of potential loss is answered not by holding tighter, but by opening the hands and letting what has been kept flow outward. This is what Ashoka did after Kalinga. He could have built more fortresses. He built shade trees. He planted the roads with them. The great roads of his empire, the arteries along which commerce and armies moved. He lined them with shade trees so that travelers could rest. Not because shade trees win wars or secure borders or demonstrate power, because shade trees help people. Because he had finally, after 100,000 deaths, decided that helping people was the point. The first welfare state in human history was built from grief, not from ideology, not from political philosophy, not from economic theory, not from the calculation of what would most efficiently consolidate his power, from grief, from the specific, irreducible body-level experience of a man who had stood on the killing field he had made and let himself feel what he had done. He did not become a pacifist in the sense of dismantling his army or refusing all force. He did not retreat from political life into a purely spiritual existence. He did not use the Dhamma as an ideology that required everyone in his empire to practice or believe exactly as he did. He maintained political power, he continued to govern, and he continued to make the 1,000 daily decisions that governing an empire requires. But the quality of what he was governing for had changed. The what is all of this in service of had changed. No, the question that organized his choices had changed. Before Kalinga, the question was, what increases my power? After Kalinga, the question was, what reduces suffering? That shift, available to a king, not available to a meditator in a Burmese village, available to you in whatever configuration your life has taken, is the shift the teaching is pointing at, not a change of circumstances, and a change of what the circumstances are organized around, a change in the root question, what reduces suffering? Pasenadi eventually found his answer. Not as a philosophical proposition, but as a practice, a quality of daily attention, a way of meeting the moments of his life that was slightly less defended, slightly less organized around the maintenance of the fortress. He remained a king. He continued to have the grief that kings have and the fear that power generates. But something in the quality of his relationship to that grief and that fear had shifted in the specific direction that the teaching shifts things when it is received and practiced rather than merely heard. He had asked whether there was anything that could not be lost. Not. The answer the teaching gave him was not a list of indestructible possessions. It was a way of seeing that could not be taken by external circumstances. Not because it was hidden from the world, not because it was removed from the world, but because it was grounded in something more fundamental than what the world can give or take. The direct, clear, present moment recognition of what is actually here, jnana, and the knowing that lands in the body. The knowing that Kisa Gotami arrived at somewhere between the 40th and 50th door, that Ashoka arrived at on a battlefield in Kalinga, that Ledi Sayadaw arrived at by watching the monasteries lose their patronage and choosing to plant the seed in different soil. The knowing that is not learned but lived into, and that is available to you, not as a promise, and as an observation based on every figure in this story, every door, every grief, every king and courtesan and mother and killer and monk, that this knowing is not the exclusive property of the exceptional. It is the eventual destination of anyone who keeps walking. And if this is finding you at the right moment, if something in Pasenadi's question or Ledi Sayadaw's decision or Ashoka's shade trees is landing somewhere real in you tonight, consider subscribing. None. It is a small gesture that helps these stories reach the people who need them. The notification bell is there too, and now, back to Kisa Gotami. She has been walking this whole time. She is near the place where the road changes. And in the 7th century of the Common Era, a Chinese monk set out on a journey that would take him 17 years. His name was Xuanzang. He left China without imperial permission, which was illegal, which meant he was smuggling himself out of his own country in the company of a single guide who abandoned him in the desert. and he walked west, across the Gobi Desert, across the Tian Shan Mountains, and through the kingdoms of Central Asia, into the subcontinent that had given the world the teaching he had devoted his life to understanding. He was looking for original Sanskrit manuscripts of the Buddhist canon, because the Chinese translations he had studied contained contradictions and ambiguities that he needed to resolve at the source. He was gone for 17 years. When he came back, he had with him 657 Sanskrit texts, an entire library carried in crates on the backs of horses and camels and porters across the mountain passes and deserts he had crossed in the other direction. He spent the rest of his life translating them. He is the reason large portions of the Buddhist canon exist in Chinese today. But the thing I want to tell you about Xuanzang is not his library, it is his journals, and he kept meticulous records of everything he saw, the kingdoms he passed through, the monasteries he visited, the relics and sacred sites, the state of Buddhist practice in the various regions he traveled, and when he came to the sites associated with the Buddha's own life and teaching, the places in the Ganges plain where the great events of the tradition had occurred. He wrote about what he found there with a quality of attention that is almost unbearable to read if you understand what he is describing. He found ruins, not the word as metaphor, actual ruins, the great centers of early Buddhism, the places where the Buddha had taught, where the disciples had practiced, where Kisa Gotami had walked with her grief, and Patacara had been called back to herself, and Anathapindika had built the garden where the teaching took root. Many of them were, by Xuanzang's time, rubble and overgrown foundations. Etavana, the great monastery outside Savatthi, was still partially standing. He describes the main gate, some of the structures, the outline of the garden, but it was a shadow of what it had been. The city of Savatthi itself had shrunk to a small village. The population that had once filled those streets, those markets, those neighborhoods where Kisa Gotami had gone door to door, gone. He wrote about standing in those places and feeling something he could not quite name. Not despair exactly, and something more complex. The feeling that arises when you are standing in a place where something enormous happened, and the enormous thing has been swallowed by time, and what remains is mostly silence, and the shape of foundations in the earth and the knowledge, and carried in your chest of what this ground once was. He lit incense. He circumambulated the ruins. He wept by his own account. Not with grief exactly, more with the quality of feeling that the tradition calls samvega, a word that does not translate neatly into English, but points at something like the shock of clarity, the sudden visceral recognition of impermanence that strikes you not as a philosophical proposition but as a physical fact, a feeling you get when you are holding something that was once enormously alive and is now still anicca. The first mark of existence here at full scale, not the impermanence of a single human life, but the impermanence of civilizations, of cities, of the very institutions built to transmit the teaching about impermanence. The teaching about impermanence had itself become impermanent. And here is what Xuanzang also found, which matters as much as the ruins. In the villages near the ruins, people still knew the stories, not the doctrines, not the philosophical system, not the technical Pali terminology or the numbered lists of the Abhidhamma, but the stories. The woman who went looking for a mustard seed, the man who sat under the tree and found what he was looking for, a killer who couldn't catch the monk who was walking, the woman who lost everything in one afternoon and became one of the greatest teachers of her era. The stories had survived what the institutions could not. Atta, Pali for mind-heart, the two together, held in a single word because they cannot ultimately be separated. The citta of a people carries what the buildings cannot. The mind-heart is the archive that survives the burning of the library, not perfectly, not without distortion, not without the accumulated telephone game errors of 1,000 years of oral transmission. Not. It carries something that the palm leaf manuscript, however precisely transcribed, cannot carry. The living quality of the teaching, the way it feels to receive it, a specific texture of what it does when it lands in the right place at the right moment. Xuanzang understood this. He had come looking for texts, and he found texts. But what he brought home with him, in addition to the 657 Sanskrit manuscripts in the crates on the horses, was the knowledge that the teaching was alive in places the texts had not yet reached, and that the aliveness mattered more than the precision of the transcription. Now let me bring in another traveler more recent, whose journey to these same ruins carries a different quality of reflection. Jnanatiloka Mahadhira was a German-born Anton Goethe in 1878 in a prosperous family in a prosperous country, trained as a musician, who encountered Buddhism in his early 20s and never recovered from the encounter. And he went to Sri Lanka. He ordained. He became one of the first Westerners to receive full Theravada bhikkhu ordination. He spent the rest of his life with various interruptions, including internment during both world wars, because he remained a German national even in a British colony, which created complications. Translating and teaching and practicing in the country he had chosen over the one he had been born into. And he wrote about the experience of impermanence in a way that carries the weight of someone who has felt it not just as doctrine but as the texture of their own biography. He had left everything, country, family, career, the entire structure of the life that had been prepared for him by his birth and his gifts. And he had spent decades in a country that was not his, in a tradition that was not his by birth, in a body that was aging in a tropical climate that it was not designed for. He had outlived the version of himself that had made those choices. He was, in some fundamental sense, already living in the ruins of the person he had once been. And he found this, the living in ruins, to be not the difficulty of the practice, but the practice itself. The Pali word for the mind-heart that was learning to hold this, the chitta that had been through enough to stop requiring certainty, to stop requiring the structures to be intact, to have discovered that what it was looking for was not stability in the external sense, but something more like the capacity to remain present when the external structures fail, is chitta in its most developed form, the mind-heart that has been trained through years of practice and the specific education that only experience provides, to remain in the experience rather than fleeing it. This is what Kisa Gotami's chitta was becoming, not through her years of practice after the mustard seed, not the chitta that grips, that holds on, that insists on the permanence of things, the chitta that can be present with impermanence without being destroyed by it, the chitta that can stand in the ruins and feel the samvega and continue. Now, here is the resolution of the loop this story planted in chapter 10, Devadatta. He said his root wound was the grief of not being seen by someone who saw everyone equally. We said the path was not permanently closed. And here is what the tradition says about what closed it for him in this life, and what it says about why. The Milinda Panha again, Nagasena and King Milinda, but this time on a different question. Milinda asked if a person has genuine attainment but also commits great harm, which determines the outcome. Nagasena said, "It is not which is greater in the sense of a balance scale. It is the quality of what is present at the moment of death. Not the chitta is oriented toward in its final moment, what it has made its home." Devadatta, by the accounts of the tradition, died with a chitta still oriented toward grievance, not because liberation was impossible for him, because he had spent so many years training his chitta in the direction of comparison, of competition, of the burning of not being enough, that the orientation had become habitual. The way water wears a channel. The channel deepens with each passing. The chitta moves along the channel it has deepened. But the capacity was always there. The Jataka prophecy, the traditions claim that he would become a Pratyeka Buddha in some future life, is the tradition saying the capacity does not expire. The potential does not disappear because it has been neglected or misdirected in one lifetime. The seed is still viable. This is not a comfortable teaching. It does not resolve the tragedy of Devadatta into something acceptable. He did real harm. The harm was real. The people he hurt were really hurt. The teaching is not that future potential cancels present harm. The teaching is that present harm does not cancel future potential. Now, both things are true at the same time. Always. Now here is Mahasi Sayadaw, the Burmese Vipassana master of the 20th century, who trained thousands of teachers, who trained tens of thousands of practitioners, who built one of the most consequential meditation centers in modern Asia, and who said something about grief that belongs here. He said, "The meditator who comes to the cushion with grief does not need to put it down first. And grief is not an obstacle to practice. Grief is the door." He said this from experience, not from theory, not from the doctrinal position that all experiences can be objects of mindfulness, though that is also true. He said it from watching hundreds of people arrive at the meditation center, carrying things they had been told they needed to resolve before they could practice. And discovering that the practice worked precisely when it was applied to the thing they were carrying, that the grief did not need to be fixed before it could be used, that it was in fact the most efficient fuel available. Because grief has already done the work of breaking through the ordinary defenses, the ordinary preference for comfortable experience, the ordinary tendency to practice only with the manageable parts of the interior life. Grief has already opened the door. The practice walks through. This is the thing Kisa Gotami knew, though she did not have the vocabulary for it. When she sat in the dust at the edge of the city with 50 doors behind her and her arms finally empty, she was not in a state that anyone would describe as ready to practice. She was in a state that Mahasi Sayadaw would recognize immediately, completely available, the defenses down, the ordinary preference for comfortable experience suspended, the door open, the practice walked through, and here is Ñāṇatiloka in his tropical monastery, decades after his ordination, writing about what has changed and what has not. He writes about the body aging in the heat, the German accent that never quite left his Pali recitation, the letters from home that arrived less frequently as the years passed and the people who had known him in his previous life died or forgot. He writes about the experience of being, in some fundamental sense, a man from ruins, the ruin of the person he had been, the ruin of the relationships that had not survived his choices, none, the ruin of the certainty that had carried him this far. And he writes that the ruins are exactly the right place to find what he came looking for, because what the teaching is pointing at is not in the intact structure. It is not in the organized life, the settled situation, the arrangement of external circumstances into something resembling permanence. It is in the capacity that remains when the structures have been removed, in what is still here when the things that were covering it are gone. Xuanzang found it in the ruins of Savatthi. Ñāṇatiloka found it in the ruins of his European self. Kisa Gotami found it in the ruins of the life she had organized around her son. The teaching does not create this capacity. The ruins reveal it. What Xuanzang wept over at the foundations of Jetavana was real loss, real impermanence, real endings, real evidence that nothing built by human hands outlasts time. And what he also found in the villages, the stories still being told 1,000 years later, was evidence that something else had survived. Not despite the ruins, through them. Because the thing the institutions had been carrying was never in the institutions. It was always in the people, in the chitta, in the living mind-heart that received the teaching and held it and passed it forward in the only way that actually works. Through the contact of one human being with another, through the kind of presence that Ananda showed Kisa Gotami, that the Buddha showed Angulimala, that Sariputta showed the dying Anathapindika. The ruins are real. The thing that survived the ruins is also real, and both at the same time. She practiced for years. This is the part of the story that does not get told often enough, not because it is hidden, but because it is ordinary, and because it does not have the dramatic shape of a cinematic moment, the single afternoon that changes everything. It does not compress well into a summary or a highlight reel or the kind of narrative that moves briskly from crisis to resolution without lingering too long in the long, unmarked, unglamorous middle. Not. But the middle is where the transformation actually happens. After the mustard seed, after the empty hands, after the Buddha's nod and the first crack in the wall of her grief, Kisa Gotami entered the Sangha. She ordained nun. She became a bhikkhuni, one of the community of ordained nuns, a community that was still young enough, in her era, to feel the newness of it, to carry the freshness of something that had just been won rather than long established. She lived in the company of other women who were also practicing. She followed the schedule, the early rising, the meditation, the alms round, the teaching periods, the evening practice, a specific rhythm of a life organized not around the acquisition of things but around the cultivation of attention. And she sat with what she was carrying, not dramatically, not in a single breakthrough session that resolved the grief into wisdom in one sitting. She sat with it the way you sit with anything real, returning to it again and again, finding it different each time, and finding that the thing you thought you had understood last week presents itself differently this week, finding that the practice opens layers rather than checking boxes on, finding that what looked like the bottom of the grief was only the bottom of one chamber, and beneath it was another chamber, and beneath that another. This is what practice is. This is what the long ordinary middle looks like. And Upalavana was there. She was the foremost female disciple in psychic powers. The Pali Canon designates her as such in the same breath that it designates Kema as foremost in wisdom. Paired descriptions that suggest the tradition's understanding that the deepest capacities come in different forms, and none of them is the complete picture alone. Upalavana had her own history of extraordinary loss. She had been, before her ordination, a woman whose life had been organized around relationships and whose relationships had failed her in ways that the tradition records with the same unflinching candor it brings to everything. She had not arrived at the path through ease. She knew something about sitting with what you are carrying. She sat with Kisa Gotami, not as a formal teacher delivering a curriculum, not as someone who had completed the path offering guidance to someone who had not, as a companion, as someone who was walking in the same direction and could offer the specific gift that only a companion on the same road can offer. Not the elevated perspective of the person who has arrived, but the steadying presence of someone who is also going and who has found through their own going that going is possible. The Pali word that describes what Upalavana offered Kisa Gotami, and what the Sangha offered, what any genuine community of practice offers when it is functioning as it should, is samadhi. You may have heard this word translated as concentration, which is accurate but incomplete. Samadhi is the unification of mind, the state in which attention, instead of the usual scattered running from sensation to sensation, thought to thought, preference to preference, gathers itself into a single point and rests there, still, luminous, held. But samadhi does not only arise in formal meditation, it arises in the presence of genuine community. When you are with people who are genuinely practicing, when the container of the Sangha is functioning, when the people around you are bringing their actual attention to their actual experience rather than managing and performing and negotiating, something in your own nervous system responds. The scattered mind begins to gather. The quality of attention in the room enters your body. You do not choose this. It happens at the level below choice, the level where the nervous system is always already in conversation with its environment. This is why the Sangha is the third refuge rather than a peripheral benefit. This is why the container matters as much as the content. Kisa Gotami was practicing in a container that held her, and over time, not in a single sitting, not in a single year, but over the long ordinary middle of a life genuinely committed to practice, her chitta changed, not the grief disappeared, not the loss ceased to be a loss. Not the face of her son became abstract or the weight of what had happened became light, but the relationship between the chitta and the grief changed. The grief was no longer the territory she was lost in, and it had become something more like the ground that the territory grew from. Still present, still real, still the specific experience of a specific loss that would always have happened. That was always going to be part of what she was, but no longer the organizing principle of everything. Ajahn Chah, the great Thai forest master of the 20th century, a teacher whose students carried his teaching across Asia and eventually across the ocean to the West, said something about this that returns to me often. He said, "Let go a little, peace a little, let go a lot, peace a lot, let go completely, peace completely." He said this as though it were a simple arithmetic, a formula, something you could calculate in advance and plan for. But anyone who has tried to apply this formula knows that the letting go he is describing is not the letting go of someone who simply decides to release their grip. It is the letting go of someone who has practiced long enough, in a container strong enough, with enough genuine companions on the road, that the grip has gradually, through years of sitting with the thing rather than running from it, through years of returning to the breath and the body and the specific present moment reality of what is actually here, the grip has gradually lost its authority, not because the thing being gripped became less precious, and because the self that was doing the gripping became less convinced that gripping was necessary. There is a story he told, Ajahn Chah, about a monk who had recently ordained after the death of his mother. And the monk had ordained out of grief, the way many people in the Theravada tradition do. The robe as a way of continuing the relationship with the person who is gone, a gift of merit, a form of love that does not require the beloved to be present to receive it. And this monk sat in the monastery and wept for 3 days, not quietly, not in the controlled way that the meditation schedule might have preferred. He wept the way a person weeps when they have finally allowed themselves to feel what they have been holding. Ajahn Chah did not tell him to stop, not suggest that the weeping was an obstacle to practice or a sign of insufficient understanding. He sat nearby and, present in the way that was his particular gift, the quality of attention that his students described as feeling like the sun, like something that warmed you without requiring anything in return. And after 3 days, the monk sat down and did not weep like that again. Not because the grief was gone, because it had moved. The weeping had done what the weeping needed to do, and the practice had given it somewhere to go. Ajahn Chah said, he let go a little, and for now that was enough. This is the pace of the actual path. This is what samadhi looks like, not as a meditation state, but as a life. The gradual, unsexy, return to it again accumulation of a little more openness, a little more capacity to be present with what is actually here, a little more willingness to feel what is real rather than what is manageable. Kisa Gotami was doing this year after year. In the early morning and the evening and the long afternoons of the dry season, when the heat of the Ganges plain makes everything slow down and the mind, if it has been trained at all, not settles into something close to the spaciousness that samadhi describes. She was becoming, through this practice, something that the community needed, a teacher, not because she declared herself one, not because someone appointed her, but in the way that genuine transformation always eventually finds its expression, in the quality of presence that a person develops when they have sat with something real for long enough to stop being afraid of it. Other women came to her, not because she was famous, not because she had credentials, but because the thing she had carried and the thing she had done with it, the specific combination of loss and practice and the long ordinary middle, was visible in her in the way that genuine things are visible, the way you can sometimes tell before a person has said anything about their history that they have been through something and have not been diminished by it. They came to her with grief, with the irreducible, impossible weight of their own losses. Children, husbands, parents, the losses that women in that world carried in particular, the losses that came from having less power, less choice, less control over the basic circumstances of your own life, and therefore more exposure to the specific grief of things you could not prevent. And she sat with them. She did not explain impermanence. She did not deliver a discourse on the 3 marks of existence. She sat with them the way Upalavana had sat with her, as a companion, as someone who was also going and who had found through her own going that going is possible. The teaching moved through her, not from her, through her. Now here is the thing the Pali word viraga describes, and this is one of the later words on the path, one that does not come early. That cannot be manufactured or rushed. That arrives only when the practice has been practiced long enough and genuinely enough that something in the chitta has fundamentally changed its orientation. Viraga, most translators give it as dispassion or fading away, but those words suggest a coldness that is not in the original. Viraga is not the deadening of feeling. It is the end of the burning, and it is the specific quality that arises when the fires of craving and aversion, the fires that drive the comparing mind, the fires that made Devadatta's grief turn outward into harm, have been allowed to cool, not extinguished by force. Cooled, the way a fire cools when you stop feeding it. The viraga that Kisa Gotami was approaching, slowly, through years of practice in the company of the Sangha, was not the end of her love for her son. It was not the transformation of the grief into indifference. It was something harder to describe and more real than that. It was the end of the burning that the love had generated when it had nowhere to go. The specific cooling that happens when love is no longer organized around the thing it lost, when it is no longer pointed backward at the specific face, the specific weight, the specific impossibility of the loss, but has opened outward into the broader space where love has no single object and therefore cannot be taken away. The love was still there. The love had always been there. But it had changed in quality, from the love that grips to the love that accompanies. From the love that requires the beloved to be present in order to continue to the love that can be present even in the beloved's absence. This is not closure. The tradition does not offer closure in the contemporary sense, the sense of a wound that heals without a scar, a grief that resolves into acceptance so complete that the loss is no longer felt. That is not what happens. What happens is something more subtle and more durable than closure. What happens is that the grief becomes part of the landscape rather than the whole of it. And the landscape, the full landscape of a life genuinely practiced, a chitta genuinely trained, a heart that has been to the bottom of something and found that the bottom is not the end, is much larger than the grief. It contains the grief, and it contains other things too. Beauty, presence, the specific quality of being awake to what is actually here, the morning light, the sound of birds, the breath moving in and out, the face of the woman sitting across from you who has come to you with something she cannot put down. Kisa Gotami sat with that woman, and in the sitting, in how she was present with it, something of what she had learned was transmitted, not as information, as something more like resonance, a tuning fork of one chitta that had found some ground, striking the tuning fork of another chitta that was still searching for it. The teaching is this. The teaching has always been this. Not the words, not the doctrine, not the numbered lists of factors and marks and truths and precepts and paths, though all of those matter and all of them point toward the thing known. The thing itself is this: what happens when one human being sits with another without flinching, in the full presence of what is actually here, without requiring it to be other than it is. That is what the Buddha did when Kisa Gotami walked through the gate of Jetavana with her son in her arms. That is what Ananda did when he brought her forward instead of sending her away. That is what Upalavana did when she sat with Kisa Gotami in the long ordinary middle. That is what Kisa Gotami did when the women came to her. The transmission goes on. It is going on right now. You are receiving something of it, in whatever form it has taken to reach you tonight. Through the layer of story, through the layer of this voice in this moment, not through the accumulated weight of 2,500 years of people who sat with this and found it true and passed it forward. This is what stays, not the buildings, not the institutions, not even the texts. No, the texts matter enormously. And the people who preserved them gave everything to the preservation. Not what stays is the quality of attention that arises when a human being has practiced long enough and genuinely enough to have developed it. The quality that says, I see you, I am not going anywhere. What you are carrying is real, and you are not alone in carrying it, and the road goes further than you can see from here. What stays is that, and the beauty of it, the thing that makes this teaching one of the most enduring human discoveries in the history of minds trying to understand what they are and what they are for, is that it cannot be taken, not by time, not by the fall of institutions, not by the burning of libraries, not by the grief that comes for everyone eventually. You cannot destroy it by attacking its container. You can only transmit it by becoming, in your own small or large or ordinary or extraordinary way, a person who has sat with what they are carrying long enough to stop being defined by it. That is the whole teaching. That has always been the whole teaching. None. Let go a little. Peace a little. If tonight something of this has found a place in you that recognizes it, if the image of Kisa Gotami in the long ordinary middle, or Upalavana sitting beside, or Ajahn Chah watching a monk weep for 3 days and saying that was enough. If any of that is doing what the teaching does when it lands, the subscribe button is there. The bell is there. These stories keep coming because people who find them useful tell other people, and those people find their way here, and the chain of transmission continues in the small modern form available to us. Thank you for being part of it. Now, the last part of her road. We promise to return to something, a question the Buddha was never asked directly, an answer he gave only once, not in words, not in a discourse, not in the numbered lists and the carefully structured progressions of the formal teaching, in a task, in a condition attached to a seed, a sending of a woman through a city full of doors that would not give her what she thought she was looking for and gave her instead what she actually needed. We are there now. But first, let me tell you about a man who came to a 10-day meditation retreat carrying a briefcase. His name was not given in the account I want to share. He had asked that it not be done. He was a successful industrialist, an Indian businessman in the 1960s, a man who had built a manufacturing company from a modest beginning into something substantial, who had an office and employees and a car and the busyness that successful people in that era wore as both armor and credential. He had chronic migraine headaches that no physician had been able to resolve. He had a marriage that was, by his own later account, present in form and mostly absent in substance. He had 2 children he loved and rarely saw. He came to the retreat because a friend had suggested it might help with the migraines. S.N. Goenka, Satyanarayan Goenka, a great Burmese Indian teacher who would go on to establish the network of Vipassana centers that now operates on every inhabited continent, who learned the technique from Sayagyi Uba Khin, who traced his lineage directly to Ledi Sayadaw, whose decision to give the teaching to lay people had set in motion a chain of transmission that arrived eventually at this industrialist with his briefcase. Goenka received him and sat for 10 days. He did not fix his marriage in 10 days. He did not resolve the grief that had been organized as busyness for so many years that it no longer felt like grief, but only like the texture of his life. He did not attain enlightenment or stream entry or any of the formal stages of the path. He sat. He observed his breath, and he observed the sensations in his body. The way the migraine was not just in his head, but in his shoulders and his jaw, and the bracing that had become so habitual he had stopped noticing it. He observed the Vedana, the feeling tone, pleasant and unpleasant, and the 1,000 varieties of neutral, arising and passing, in the body he had been living in for decades and had never quite inhabited. On the 9th day, something shifted. He could not explain it in the terms his industrial mind preferred. He said later that it was like a knot releasing that he had not known was knotted, like a breath that had been half held for years finally completing itself. Like the moment when you stop bracing for the thing you have been bracing for and discover that the bracing was causing more damage than the thing itself would have. He went home. His migraines did not immediately disappear. His marriage did not transform overnight into something it had not been. His children did not suddenly have a different father waiting for them when he returned. The external circumstances were exactly as he had left them. No, but the quality of his relationship to those circumstances had changed. Something in the center had shifted, the thing that the teaching points at, the chitta, the mind-heart, and from that shifted center, everything looked slightly different. Not better exactly, more real, more present. As though the glass he had been seeing through without knowing it was glass had been cleaned. He went back to Goenka the following year. A year after that, he is not famous. His story is not in the canon. He has no verses in the Therigatha. None. He is simply a man who came to a meditation retreat with a briefcase and left with the beginning of something he could not have predicted from the entrance. This is the teaching at the scale it most often operates, not the dramatic conversion of a killer on a forest road, not the queen's vision of beauty fading into dust, not the mother with the dead child in her arms walking through the gate of Jetavana. These are the teaching at the scale of story, the scale that can be transmitted across 2,500 years because the drama of them is large enough to carry the teaching across the distance. But underneath the drama, underneath the extraordinary cases that illuminate the principles most vividly, the teaching mostly operates quietly. In 10-day retreats, in early mornings on a meditation cushion in a room in an ordinary house, and in the quality of attention a person brings to a conversation with someone they love, in the small and unremarked and entirely real moments when something shifts in the center and everything looks slightly different. A mustard seed is not always a dead child in 50 doors. Sometimes the mustard seed is a 10-day retreat in a briefcase and a knot you did not know was knotted. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and he is an American monk, born Jeffrey Block in New York in 1944, ordained in Sri Lanka in 1972, one of the most significant scholar monks of the 20th and 21st centuries, whose translations of the major Pali Nikayas, the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, the Anguttara Nikaya, are considered the definitive English renderings, the translations that scholars and practitioners return to, because they carry both precision and the unmistakable quality of someone who has practiced what they have translated. He translated the Therigatha, the verses of the enlightened women, the collection that contains Kisa Gotami's own words, the poems that Patacara and Ambapali and Kema and Mahapajapati left as the record of their paths. And he said something about Kisa Gotami's verses that deserves to be held carefully, because it is the kind of observation that only someone who has spent years in both the scholarship and the practice can make. And he said that what is remarkable about her verses, the poems she left in the Therigatha, the words she wrote after years of practice, the record of where the road had taken her, is not their philosophical sophistication. They are not, by the standards of the canon, doctrinally complex. They are not the product of a mind that had spent years in systematic analysis of the Abhidhamma. They are simple. They are direct. They speak of grief and of the path through grief and of what was found at the end of the path with the specific economy of someone who has no interest in saying more than what is true. He said, she writes like someone who has been to the bottom of something and come back up, and what she found at the bottom, what the verses gesture toward, a specific way that poetry gestures at things that prose cannot quite reach, is not the absence of grief. It is not the philosophical resolution of the problem of impermanence. No, it is something that does not have a clean name in English, that the Pali holds more gracefully than any translation can. She found that she was larger than the grief. Not because she was exceptional, not because the grief was small, not because the love that generated it was somehow wrong or excessive or badly directed. The grief was real, the love was real, the loss was real, and she, the specific, irreplaceable, practicing, failing and returning and sitting again Chitta of Kisa Gotami, was larger than all of it. Not because she was exceptional, because that is what practice produces. When practice is genuinely practiced in a container that genuinely holds, over a time that is genuinely long enough, not the absence of suffering, the discovery that what you are is larger than what you suffer. This is the Pali word sotapanna, stream enterer, and the first level of awakening in the Theravada map of the path. The moment when, having practiced long enough and genuinely enough, the chitta crosses a threshold, not dramatically, not with trumpets, not necessarily even noticeably in the moment, from which it cannot return, a threshold from which the path continues but the falling back is no longer possible. The stream has been entered. The current now carries what the effort used to carry, not enlightenment. Not the complete cooling of all the fires, but the irreversible beginning of the ending of them. The tradition says Kisa Gotami reached this, not on the afternoon of the mustard seed, not in a single sitting, through the long ordinary middle, through the years of practice in the company of the Sangha, through Upalavana sitting beside her, and the presences of others whose names the texts do not always record, through the early mornings and the evening sessions, and the return to it again that constitutes a life in practice. Now, she entered the stream and she kept walking. Now here is the modern bridge that belongs at the end of this chapter, the strongest one, the one this whole story has been moving toward. There are people whose entire working life is the room where someone is dying. Not doctors primarily, though doctors are there. The people I am thinking of are hospice workers and palliative care nurses and the volunteers who sit with people in the last weeks and days and hours of their lives, people who have made the choice to be present with the specific, irreducible biological fact of human mortality, not as a problem to be solved, but as an experience to be accompanied. People who have done this for years, who have sat at hundreds of bedsides, and who have held hundreds of hands in the specific moment when the breathing changes and the room changes and the person who was there is no longer there. When these people are asked, and they are asked by journalists and researchers, and by the people who are beginning to attend to what hospice workers know, when they are asked what they have learned from all of that sitting, the answer is remarkably consistent across cultures, across decades, across the different configurations of loss and leave-taking that they have witnessed. People at the end do not reach for their achievements. They do not ask to be surrounded by the evidence of their success, the awards, the recognitions, the markers of a life that was significant by external measure. They reach for whoever loved them. They want the people who know their name in the specific way that people who love you know your name. Not as information, not as identification, but as recognition, as the sound of being known. And what these hospice workers observe, the thing that comes through in account after account, is that people at the end wish, most commonly, for more time with the people they love. Not more time for achievement, not more time for accumulation. More time to simply be in the presence of the people who make presence feel like enough. They reach for whoever loved them, and they wish. This is the consistent thread, the thing that crosses every cultural and religious and demographic boundary in these accounts. They wish they had understood earlier, not later in life, earlier. They wish they had known, when they still had time to organize their lives around it, that the connection was the point, that the presence was the point. That being genuinely with another person, without the armor and the performance and the careful management of impression, was not a luxury or a reward or something to be attended to after the important things were done. It was the important thing. It was always the important thing. The Buddha sent Kisa Gotami door to door, not to find a house without death. He sent her to find out that every house has someone who will stay. That is the answer he gave her. not in words, in a task. In the specific experience lived rather than explained, of going to 50 doors and finding at every one of them the evidence of love that had stayed even when the person it was directed at had gone on. Of finding that the world is full of people who have loved and lost and are still here, still carrying it, still willing when a stranger knocks on the door to open it. The question was, can I bear this? The answer was, go find out. And what she found, in every house, at every door, in the names that people spoke of their dead and the way their voices changed when they spoke them, was not that the answer was no. The answer was, you are not alone. You have never been alone. Everyone at every door carries this, and that changes everything. Not because it makes the loss smaller, because it makes the person larger, and because it reveals, the way the ruins revealed what had survived them, the way the 50 doors revealed what lived behind every one of them. That the self which is carrying the grief is not the fragile, isolated, uniquely burdened thing it believed itself to be. That it is and has always been embedded in a web of shared human experience, so vast and so ancient that no single loss, however enormous, is sufficient to place you outside it. You are in it. You have always been in it. The mustard seed is the proof, the Pali word for what Kisa Gotami arrived at. The level of awakening, the threshold crossed, is sotapanna, stream enterer. Upaya is the Sanskrit word for what the Buddha used to bring her there, skillful means. The task that was not a task but an experience. The seed that was not a seed but a door. And the teaching continues to be this. Is this right now? In the quality of attention you have brought to this story tonight, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying, whatever version of the 50 doors you are currently walking through, you knocked on this door, and this door opened. That is not nothing. You have walked a long way tonight, so has she. So have all of them. The women whose names we have carried through this story, the kings and monks and travelers and killers and courtesans who appeared on the road and showed us something of what the road makes possible. Kisa Gotami, Patacara, Ambapali, Kema, Mahapajapati, Angulimala, Ashoka, Pasanadi, Ananda, always Ananda, walking toward the people the formal structure didn't know what to do with. The monk Xuanzang weeping at the ruins of a garden that is now farmland. A German in a tropical monastery discovering that ruins are the right place to find what you came for. They are all here in the room with us, the way that people who have walked a road before you are always present on the road, not as ghosts, not as abstract inspirations, but as the specific warmth of the path already having been worn, the ground already knowing what feet feel like. Sit down for a moment before we close. There are 3 things Kisa Gotami knows now that she did not know the morning she walked into Jetavana with her son in her arms. And 3 things that the road gave her, not quickly, not all at once, not without cost, but gave her in the specific way that the teaching gives things, through experience rather than explanation. Through the living of it rather than the hearing of it. I want to give them to you now, not as doctrine, as the distillation of everything this story has been moving toward. I gathered into 3 things you can carry out of tonight with you. 3 things that will fit, if you let them, into whatever version of the road you are walking. The first thing she knows now is this. Grief is not the opposite of wisdom. It is the doorway. Not despite the grief. Not after the grief is safely over and has been tidied away and processed into something acceptable. Through it. The grief was the door. The specific opening in the ordinary defenses. The place where the armor was thin enough that something true could get in. The 50 doors she knocked on were not obstacles between her and the teaching. They were the teaching. The teaching was in the knocking, in the refusals, in the woman with the child on her hip who said, I am sorry, and meant it. The teaching was in the sitting down in the dust when the walking had used up everything she had. If you are in grief right now, if tonight found you because something in you recognized the weight we have been describing, if the image of Kisa Gotami holding what she could not put down landed in a specific place, then hear this. You are not behind. You are not failing the path by feeling what you feel. You are not in a preliminary stage that needs to be completed before the real work begins. The grief is the real work. It has already opened the door. The question is only whether you will walk through it or stand in the doorway. She walked through it. She became a teacher because she couldn't find the mustard seed. Remember that. The second thing she knows now is this. You are not more alone in your loss than Kisa Gotami was in hers. She went to every door in Savatthi. She knocked, she asked, and at every door, the wealthy household and the poor one, the house of the old man with his memories in every corner and the young mother with the living child on her hip. At every door she found the same thing. Evidence that love had been here. Evidence that loss had been here. Evidence that someone had stood at this threshold with something they could not put down and had eventually somehow continued. The world is full of these thresholds. It always has been. The city you live in, wherever it is, if you could go door to door through it tonight, you would find the same inventory that Kisa Gotami found. Not in every house right now, not every household in the acute stage, but in every household. If you count back far enough, if you include all the versions of love and all the versions of losing it that accumulate in any life, lived all the way to its end, you are standing in a country with a very large population. And the people who came before you, every woman in the Theragatha, every monk in the Theragatha, every pilgrim who walked to the ruins and wept and kept going, every ordinary practitioner whose name is not recorded, but whose practice was no less real for being unnamed. They all knocked on the same doors you are knocking on. They all found the same empty hands you are holding. And they kept walking. The stream flows forward. The current carries what the effort used to carry, and you are in it, in the specific, ancient, unbroken stream of human beings who have sat with what they could not fix and found, somewhere in the sitting, that the sitting itself was the answer. You are not alone in it. You have never been alone in it. The third thing, the last thing, the one that carries the most weight, the one I want to leave with you, is this. The Buddha never promised to take the pain away. He sent her further into it, into the streets, into the doors, into the specific, irreducible, house-by-house evidence of what it means to be a human being who loves things that are mortal. He did not sit her down and explain impermanence until the explanation made the pain smaller. He did not offer her a practice that would allow her to feel her grief from a safe distance, to observe it without being in it, to achieve the kind of spiritual remove from her own experience that some people mistake for liberation. He sent her into the grief, into the full contact with it, with her grief and with everyone else's grief, with the specific weight of her son's body in her arms and with the specific weight of every inventory of the dead that every door offered her. He sent her into all of it. And what she found at the end of the road, what the teaching was pointing at all along, what the mustard seed was never really about in the first place, was not the absence of grief, and it was the discovery that she was large enough to hold it. The self she had believed was shattered. It was never as fragile as she thought. That underneath the self that gripped, underneath the self that required her son to be alive in order to feel whole, was something that had not required anything to be other than it was. Something that had been there before the grief and would be there after it. Not permanent in the sense that it would last forever. Nothing is permanent. The teaching is clear about this, and even the liberated mind eventually follows the body into its ending. No, but stable in a way that external circumstances cannot reach. Grounded in a way that loss cannot unground. She was large enough to hold it, and so are you. Not because you are exceptional. Not because your grief is small, not because the loss did not happen or does not matter or can be philosophically resolved into something acceptable. Because that is what practice produces, when practice is genuinely practiced, in a container that genuinely holds, over a time that is genuinely long enough, not the absence of suffering, the discovery that what you are is larger than what you suffer. She knew this now. She had known it for years in the long ordinary middle, the early mornings and the evening sessions and the company of women who were also walking. She knew it the way you know things that have been lived rather than learned. In the body, in the quality of the breath, a specific texture of how she met the women who came to her. She knew it the way a river knows the sea, not as information, as direction. And here she is now, the elder teacher, the former thin one, the slight one, the one without much, sitting under a tree in the late afternoon in a city that will one day be ruins and is not yet ruins, with her students around her. The light is the particular gold of late afternoon in that part of the world. And the trees are old enough to provide real shade. Someone is asking her a question. One of the younger women, still near the beginning of the road, still carrying something she does not yet have words for, and Kisa Gotami listens. And she listens the way the Buddha listened when she walked through the gate, the way Ananda listened when he brought her forward, the way Upalavana listened in all the long ordinary hours of the middle. She listens without flinching, without requiring the grief to be smaller or more manageable or over before she will fully receive it. She listens with the chitta of someone who has been to the bottom of something and found that the bottom is not the end. The younger woman finishes speaking, and Kisa Gotami says in whatever words the moment provides, "I know, I carried something too. Let me tell you what I found." The students do not know what her arms once held, but somehow, in the way she teaches, in the quality of her presence, in the specific warmth of a chitta that has been through fire and is no longer burning, they feel it. They feel what was in her arms, and they feel what she did with it. And the teaching moves through the afternoon like light through leaves. Not created by the leaves, not destroyed when the leaves fall, not diminished by the 10,000 times it has moved through 10,000 other trees, in 10,000 other afternoons in the 2,500 years, since a woman walked through a gate with her son in her arms, and a teacher looked at her and did not look away. No, she became a teacher because she couldn't find the mustard seed. The comment I want to leave you with tonight, the one I'd love to see in the box below this video, the one that helps other people find these stories, is this: of all the doors she knocked on, of all the moments in this journey, which one stayed with you? Which threshold did you find yourself standing at? Tell me. Tell the people who will read it after you, because that is also a form of the transmission. That is also a door being opened, a story being passed from one chest to another in the specific way that only honest human speech can pass things. There is a subscribe button here and a notification bell, and if these stories are finding you in a useful way, I am grateful for the small gesture of pressing them. It is how more people find their way to this doorstep. But more than any of that, wherever you are tonight, whatever you are carrying, whatever version of the 50 doors you are walking through, know this: the road goes further than you can see from here, and you are not walking it alone.